Mika Mayer. Good evening, everyone, to this presentation on The Last Briton. I'll get into what I mean by that in a minute. Now, this might seem an odd tangent for people who are following the chronology of the streams I'm doing, where I've just come from the fall of the Soviet Union. How does this relate to the career of a British politician around primarily in the 60s and 70s, who is most known by the public for a single speech delivered in Birmingham in 1968? Well, this discussion on Powell really enables me to form a cohesive epilogue for the various discussions I've had regarding the nature and the fall of the British Empire. Really, I think discussing Powell is a wonderful cap-off because the ideology and the actions of Powell's political career, as far as I'm concerned, represent an aspect of transition and decline from the British Empire to the prospect of a nation state. What I mean by prospect is because, worse than this, Powell foresaw the death of a potential British sovereignty with the death of an empire, as the rump of what was left of the empire, the UK, had effectively transitioned from an empire to a client state. And I think anyone looking at the situation of Britain nowadays can't really be disabused of that notion that we are, in fact, a client state. So this is a discussion on the failure of British sovereignty and nationality. And to my mind, this evokes the notion that Enoch Powell is the last Briton, the last politician who I think really was cognizant of this fact and tried to do something about it. Because again, something very frustrating when looking at the modern Conservative Party is that it is ideologically destitute, and it has been that way a long time. Powell is an interesting contrast for that. But as for a summary for people who want to know more about Enoch Powell, this isn't going to be a biography. People in the chat have already mentioned Simon Heffer's biography. There's also Cosgrave's biography. This is really going to be a discussion about the ideology of Powell and how he relates to this idea of the British Empire transitioning into that of a client state. Also, considering everyone focuses on immigration with Enoch Powell, I'm not that focused on immigration. Of course, I will discuss it, and I will be reading the Birmingham speech in full on this stream, so you're not left without context. But I'm primarily focused on this from a foreign policy angle, and indeed from a constitutional point of view. And again, this bears weird similarities with what I was discussing about Gorbachev and the end of empire. And you'll find more about that in a moment. But as for this epithet I've given Enoch Powell of the Last Briton, I'm sure many people will find that rather controversial, but I'll explain why. This, of course, is a reference to the segment in the Birmingham speech where Enoch Powell says, "Like the Roman, I seem to see the Tiber foaming with much blood." Of course, Enoch Powell was a classical scholar. I'm just going to read a short segment written by Andrew Pearce in the Times some 30 years ago. Contrary to popular mythology, Enoch Powell never predicted that rivers would flow with blood if immigration continued unchecked. Mastering his considerable classical learning as a former professor of Greek, he quoted the doom-laden prophecies of a mythical female soothsayer in the sixth book of Vergil's Aeneid, who had interpreted a vision of a bloodied river Tiber as an omen of approaching misfortune, which of course is going to be the consistent theme throughout this discussion. On the same page is quoted the sentence, "Like the Roman, I seem to see the Tiber foaming with much blood." One of the charges, again, laid against Enoch Powell among many, is that this was a mistranslation, that really the quote from the Aeneid read, "War, dreadful war, and the Tiber flood, I see incarnadined with blood." In terms of being able to explain what I mean by this array of criticisms regarding Powell, I'm just going to read this segment specifically about his use of that phrase, which was written by one Herbert Huxley. "I should like to say a few words about the astounding choice of the Aeneid for a speech on immigration. acceptable as it was to most of those who took the trouble to write to an MP about it. Of the approximately 45,000 letters commenting on the speech, all but a few thousand were favourable. These included a round robin signed by all immigration officers stationed at Heathrow Airport. Very, very few of the small audience of conservatives who heard the speech would have the faintest inkling of Aeneas's mission, still less of the purport of what the Sibyl of Cumae was prophesying. The opening words of the epic, I sing of arms and of the man fated to be in exile, make clear to any Latinist that the hero is himself an immigrant fleeing with his father, his son, and the wife he is soon to lose, the horrors of defeat in battle, looting, burning, and massacre. His future appears to be devoid of all hope. We learn later in the story that he is in essence a man of peace, whose hope is that a sufficient parcel of land will be granted to him without recourse to fighting, and that his small band will not be averse to intermarriage with his Italian hosts. No, Mr. Powell, I am convinced that you call to mind a famous Latin tag, but little else. So at one time, he is using this vivid metaphor relating to impending doom. And there are people coming out from the academic community, his own sort of academic background of being a classicist, and saying that this is all sound and fury referring to nothing. And my response to this would be to simply ask Huxley whether Julius Caesar, who considered himself a descendant of Aeneas, would declare before the people of Rome, I stand here as a descendant of immigrants. Yes, that is a fetish used by many modern politicians, and I think the ridiculousness of that statement should be self-evident. But this is Huxley's gotcha moment. And I consider this a form of disingenuous pedantry, and this is rife when encountering assessments of Powell. Assessments accusing him of everything from mistranslating the Latin to stirring up ethnic hatred. But my reference to Caesar brings up another point as to the means of framing tonight's presentation, relaying this back to the last Briton. Julius Caesar had, perhaps apocryphally, referenced this idea of Brutus being the last Roman, the man who would ultimately assassinate him. Brutus, of course, being from the line of the Brutii who deposed the last kings of Rome, and represents this form of idealism harkening back to the principles of the old Roman Republic, which was about to collapse, or rather transition into the Principate. That's one aspect to which you think of the last Roman in terms of the death of an idea, but there are many more facets to that. As it pertains to Enoch Powell, I would actually invite comparisons with Cicero. Cicero is both a politician and an orator, but again, such an appellation doesn't necessarily do Enoch Powell justice in a sense, because Powell was straddling that line between adherence to a Britain that was dying, yet also, and also, of course, being an orator, but he was also appealing to populism, like a Julius Caesar, in order to counteract that sense of decline and negation of nationhood. Then it comes to another aspect of the last Roman. This is something implicit throughout the works of Edward Gibbon, which is the figure of Stilicho. Stilicho was a Roman Vandal general who was attempting to shore up the position of the Western Roman Empire as the Goths had invaded and would ultimately sack Rome a couple of years after his death. But Stilicho is one of these resilient figures in Roman history, trying to prevent the collapse of the Roman Empire, and yet is ultimately betrayed by his own side. Again, that's far more dramatic, but there are somewhat similarities in terms of Powell being ostracized from mainstream political life in Britain. But regarding this notion of the last Roman, these are all references to, on one side, decline of an idea of Rome and the decline of the Roman Empire. I'm not going to refer to him as a Flavius Aetius or a Belisarius, even though he fought in World War II. I'm not looking at him as some sort of great heroic military figure holding back the tide. That certainly isn't the case. But all of these references dating back to Enoch Powell's own classicism and his evocative use of the Aeneid in terms of being able to conjure up imagery and apocalypse when it comes to the state of Britain should be enough to justify why I'm looking at Enoch Powell within the context of being a contender for the last Briton. As for the references I'm going to be using for tonight's conversation, I have what turned out to be a rather interesting book by Paul Corthorn, Enoch Powell, Politics and Ideas in Modern Britain, which isn't a biography, but it is an assessment of Powell's consistent thinking on a variety of topics. And he has done the wonderful job of providing a one-page summary of Enoch Powell's life, which I'll read here. John Enoch Powell, the only child of teachers, was born in Stetchford in Birmingham in 1912. He won a scholarship to King Edward's School, Birmingham. From there, a scholarship to study classics at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he cut a solitary figure but excelled academically, graduating with first-class honours. Already calling himself J. Enoch Powell to avoid confusion with the famous classicist J. U. Powell, he secured a fellowship at Trinity before being appointed a professor of Greek at the University of Sydney at the age of 25. Just a note on that. I think he had ambitions to be the youngest professor ever appointed. And I don't mean professor in the colloquial American sense of the word. I mean professor in terms of a distinguished academic post in the university. I believe at the time the only person who had beat him in terms of his age and the appointment was one Friedrich Nietzsche. At the same time, Powell has started to write and publish poetry. At the start of the Second World War, he returned to England to enlist in the army as a private and rose through the ranks to become a brigadier in military intelligence. Powell voted Labour in 1945 to register his disapproval of appeasement, but on returning to civilian life in 1946, he worked at Conservative Central Office before winning the seat of Wolverhampton South West in 1950. The Midlands constituency he represented until 1974. Married to Pam from 1952, with whom he had two daughters, Powell first held government office as Parliamentary Secretary at the Ministry of Housing in 1955, Financial Secretary to the Treasury in 1957, resigning the following year when calls for cuts to public spending were rejected by the Cabinet. He was subsequently Minister of Health between 1960 and 63, joining the Cabinet in 62, but then 15 months later, refusing to serve under new leader-elect Douglas Home. Powell put his name forward in the Conservative Party leadership contest in 1965, but came last. He was Shadow Defence Minister from 65, but was sacked from the position by party leader Edward Heath after he made his so-called Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham in 1968. From this point on, Powell became one of the best-known politicians in the country, vilified and sanctified at the same time. As his relations with the Conservative leadership worsened, and in opposition to party policy, in favour of membership of the European Community, the European Economic Community, which would come on to be the European Union, Powell decided not to stand in the February 1974 general election, asking his supporters instead to vote for the Labour Party, which was committed to a referendum on the European issue. Powell subsequently took the unusual step for a British politician of contesting a seat in Northern Ireland, Southdown, as an Ulster Unionist in October 1974 general election, which he held until he was defeated in an election in 1987. Powell then died in 1998. I can see Lady of Shalott is in the chat, maybe considering her interest in Northern Ireland. She has a particular opinion on Powell. I'll be interested to see that, Lady of Shalott, in the comments section. I will also be reading this evening from a lot of Powell's own statements, and I feel it's instructive going forward as to consider what Powell understands the nation of being, because in the context of this being an epilogue of the decline and fall of the British Empire, and then the denied prospect of British statehood, nationalism is the essence of this stream, and so it is only appropriate that we discuss Powell's thoughts on nationalism, and this is quoting Powell directly. The essence must be a view of the state, the nation, and of this nation in particular, referring to the United Kingdom, as an organic entity in time, the life of which is part conscious, part unconscious, like that of a human microcosm. From this view follows a specific attitude to the relationship between individuals comprised in that entity, to sovereignty, class, privilege, liberty. There follows also a specific attitude to change and to the expansion and contraction of the nation. The natural, the supernatural enter into the composition of the state as they do into that of the individual. The Tory approach to the past in this regard, and his nation, could be expressed in the words of thy commandment, honour thy father and mother, that thy days may be long and land that the Lord thy God have given thee. So this is a very particular and I would say conservative in the truer sense. If I were to be sort of more specific, I would even say reactionary in terms of looking at the nation as an organic organism, not something arbitrary or something which is simply defined by a constitution, but something defined as a representation of the people, of the history. And indeed, history is essential in terms of being able to understand this particular view of British statehood. There are echoes of being able to look at the early German nationalist figures in the 19th century, and of course of French thinkers in the late 19th century. And indeed, this is a complete contrast to the idea that Britain is essentially anyone can become British. There is a very particular notion of Britain as rooted in history, rooted in time, as being an inheritance from the previous generation. The idea that there is an aspect of blood and soil about it. I don't really think that's controversial to say. But it's not just that. It's inheriting a series of ideas regarding the English liberty and English sovereignty. British sovereignty in terms of being able to invest sovereignty in certain institutions, such as the Crown and Parliament. By the Crown in Parliament, I mean the executive authority represented by the government and vested in Parliament. And the Crown in Parliament is an idea represented in constitutional history. For people who find this rather long-winded, I'll try and make this as simplistic as possible. The notion of Crown in Parliament, the idea that Parliament and the executive hand, representing the King's or the Queen's government, represent a form of symbiosis. This is the settlement which was created after the Dutch coup in 1688. And this is very much the mode in which Powell is thinking, being able to harmonize a conception of these institutions representing a sovereign entity to the world. And any diminution of that sovereignty would necessarily mean a diminution of the sovereignty of the nation. This also means that Powell has a very particular conception of democracy, which is bound up in these institutions, which again would make him consistent with a lot of conservative thinkers of that time. Democracy is complex here, on the one hand referencing the popular will as an organism in and of itself, individuals, and then being able to extrapolate this and place this idea onto an entire group of people, the nation. But in terms of democracy representing a representative institution bound up in Parliament, augmented and facilitated by a sovereign monarchy, all of these things come to mind when talking of Powell, but liberty as an essential component to Powell. Liberty, not just in the sense that a Britishman is able to speak his mind. He's able to disapprove of government policy. This, to me, harkens back even before World War I. It refers to an almost timeless, ancient conception of British liberty going back to pre-Norman conquest. Or I know this is a tired analogy, which I don't necessarily agree with, but the spirit, let's say, rather than the fact of Magna Carta. And for Powell, this went beyond confirming the ancient liberties of the English, which was an aspect of nationalism and particularism for the English. But this is also referring back to the fact that economically, the British should be free. And this helped form his own opposition to the socialist policies of the Labour government, which ironically he voted for in 1945. And he believed that economic policy and an idea of liberty could be bound up with a specific conception of British nationalism. Moreover, however, he believed that such a conception of liberty had to be bound within the people of the United Kingdom. It could not be extended too liberally without severe repercussions, of which we'll get into. So moving on from that, how does this figure into the empire picture? And I'm reading from Corthorn again here. At the start of the 1950s, Powell held that in the broadest sense, the empire was the nation. But by 1954, he was clear that with Britain unwilling and unable to defend its remaining empire, collapse was inevitable. As decolonization gathered pace in the late 1950s and early 1960s, India, of course, had left in 1947. Powell grappled with the vanished empire, arguing that the nationhood of the mother country remained unaltered through it all. In this respect, he viewed an acceptance of and an allegiance to the unlimited supremacy of the Crown in Parliament, characterizing the unbroken life of the English nation over 1,000 years. Defining the English nation in terms of the constitutional development of the Crown in Parliament that had been common practice from the mid to late 19th century through to the 1950s, and from the late 1940s, Powell himself spent 20 years working sporadically on the early history of the House of Lords. Yet for Powell, this dimension of time not only gave the nation the sense of having belonged together in the past, but also the expectation of belonging together in the future. So the notion of Britain is is eternal. The empire you can see to be an extension of that, but his focus is on Britain being able to survive the expansion of Britain into an empire and then the contraction into a nation state. Conflating England and Britain was a common occurrence, especially among the English, but from the mid-1960s onwards, Powell spoke more consistently about the British nation defined by the geographical borders of the United Kingdom. At the Conservative Party conference in 1965, as Shadow Defence Minister, he asked, "What do we mean by the nation?" and answered, "I will say what I believe we mean. We mean the United Kingdom." 3 years later, with the rise of Scottish and Welsh nationalism, meaning that the unity of the realm could no longer be taken for granted, Powell urged the Tory party above all to think and speak about the future of the United Kingdom, because nationhood is what the Tory party is ultimately about. Powell continued developing this position he had, as outlined in his Biography of a Nation, and this is quoting Powell directly. Nationhood is a baffling thing, for it is wholly subjective. They are a nation who think they are a nation. There is no other definition. You cannot discover nations by poring over atlases, for the geography influences nationhood. It does not determine it in any specific way. Nations merge with others in the passage of time, while others emerge or re-emerge. Language and race are relevant to nationhood, though they are not definitive determinants of it. As for the slippery concept of race, all attempts to match it with nationality are foredoomed to failure. The consequence is that the emergence or the existence of a nation is only visible when it is there, when it has happened, when the sense of being a nation has been demonstrated to itself and to the outside world in actual fact. On this basis, Powell was clear that if it were ever the settled and preponderant wish of the inhabitants of either Wales or Scotland no longer to be part of this nation, that wish ought not to be resisted. And by that he means if there was no longer a psychic conception of Scotland and Wales as belonging to a British nation, indeed referring to the British nation as essentially what it thinks it is, that being a subjective qualifier which is bound up in all of these other aspects, then that's an interesting thing to consider in terms of an evolving concept, which is taking the limits of a perceived subjectivity on nationalism to its absolute extreme in the modern day. So, from that point of view, I hope you have a general view, a general understanding of what Powell means by nation and how we can see this current developing throughout his entire thought. And this is what I really want to get into the meat of, which is foreign policy. And foreign policy is going to link back to his views on the joining of the European Economic Community, later the European Union, and his thoughts on immigration, and indeed the tail end of his career, which was that of serving as a Ulster Unionist MP in Northern Ireland. In an early journalistic contribution in summer of 1949, Powell noted with some trepidation the formidable position in which the outcome of the Second World War had left the United States. By this stage, the Cold War Anglo-American relationship had been firmly established. Back in 1946, Winston Churchill, as leader of the opposition, had called in his famous Iron Curtain speech for a fraternal association with the United States involving intimate relations between our military advisors for mutual security in order to check Soviet ambitions. Earliest in 1949, the Labour government, with Foreign Secretary Ernst Bevin to the fore and with Conservative backing, had played a prominent part in establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a system of US-led collective defense, yet Powell was at odds with this type of thinking. Indeed, Powell had anxiously anticipated the development of American power as early as 1942 when he was based in North Africa. In 1942, the Americans had helped facilitate the British victory at El Alamein. They had also set off Operation Torch, which led to the fall of Vichy France in North Africa, and this would lead to the invasion of Tunisia and ultimately the invasion of Italy. Strikingly, Powell's definition of the national interest was already clear, a concept that Morgenthau later expounded extensively in his Politics Among Nations. Powell argued that if a foreign state desists from the attempt to interfere with our self-determination, our relations with that state cease to be affected by internal politics. On this basis, he contended that there was no reason to believe that the British Constitution would be threatened more by the socialist dictatorship than by the democracy of the United States. And this is a consistent theme. If I'm going to be using that term consistent theme, that might in turn become a consistent theme of this stream. I do apologize if I liberally repeat myself with redundant phrases such as that. But regardless, to him, focusing on the idea of British sovereignty, which has already been elucidated, this idea of a fraternal association, as Churchill has referred to it as, it's also interesting to point out that I believe Powell, in many senses, was the anti-Churchill. He was not prepared to allow Britain simply to enter into a client status compared to that of the overall US-led empire, hence understanding his original trepidation of NATO. And within this regard, he is looking to both sides of the spectrum of the Cold War and focusing his understanding of foreign policy squarely on the interests of Britain. Working on the basis that Britain had been able to fight a war, if necessarily against the United States, Powell's balance of power thinking led him to argue that Britain needed allies to counterbalance the material superiority of the United States. The theory of the balance of power assumed the existence of two or more states of roughly equal strength, the desire of the states to survive and maintain their autonomy, flexibility in making alliances, and the ability to resort to war if necessary. In this respect, Powell acknowledged that the total defeat of Germany by the Red Army would create a dangerous vacuum in Europe, and suggested that a strong and independent Germany might actually be in Britain's interests. Powell had enjoyed a youthful interest in German culture, but had increasingly feared war with National Socialist Germany from the mid-1930s. Powell's particular concern was that with the increase in US naval strength, the British Empire would only exist on American sufferance. Here, Powell's definition of the national interest was geographically broad, mirroring his understanding of the British nation at this stage. Reading across the Pacific as well as the Atlantic, he held that the life principle of Britain's empire is the actual or potential preponderance of her navy, or rather preeminence of her navy on all the seas of the world. Powell was especially concerned about the US aim to eradicate Japanese naval power, because the existence of Japan's navy always offers the means to counterbalance America in the Pacific while confronting her at the Atlantic. At a time when the war was just beginning to turn against Japan, but in the same year that has seen the fall of Singapore, until then governed as a crown colony within the British Empire, to Japan, Powell suggested that it was not in the British interest to preserve its naval strength through means not even short of an alliance with Japan. Within this imperial strategic analysis, India, where Powell was based from summer of 1943, assumed a central place. At the end of 1944, he wrote, "Without the power to deny India to an enemy and to make use of at least its ports and airfields, Britain can neither hold her possessions farther east, nor protect the dominions of Australia and New Zealand, nor in the long run maintain even her positions in the Middle East." Powell considered that the Indian population was either indifferent or hostile to the British connection, but that it was still essential to keep firm and substantial control until the latest possible moment. Powell took this strategic assumption with him to the Conservative Parliamentary Secretariat, where he worked from 1946 and specialized in defense. By this stage, in the bipolar post-war world, fears of British decline loomed large. Powell argued that the only effective answer to the prospect of being crushed economically, which in the end means politically and militarily also, between two much greater individual powers, Russia and the United States, lies in her African and Asiatic dependencies, and above all in the Indian Empire, aspiring towards autonomous dominion status for all the empire. Powell contended that the Indian experience determined the hopes of a lasting union between white and coloured, with the conception of a common subjecthood to the King Emperor. Powell argued that Britain's pride and self-confidence would be dealt a blow if this proved impossible. In the events, of course, Indian independence was granted by the Labour government in the summer of 1947. Moreover, much to Powell's regret and contrary to his demand for Britain to resume full control, the Conservative Party eventually agreed to it, even though without agreement between the main Indian parties, it involved the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. So here, in terms of being able to conceive of a wider sense of British nationality emanating out through the empire, the focus is on great power status, but there is also this emphasis on loyalty to the crown, loyalty to the institutions, and subjecthood, not citizenship, subjecthood to the monarchy. So once the conception of power and nationality is democratic in terms of being able to represent the nation, but also imperialistic and rooted in the ideas of monarchy as being able to legitimate the presence and endurance of the British state, being able to hold on to this power as long as possible, and by what you can say ideological contrivance as possible. It's also important to note that Powell's experience in India led him to a unique understanding and appreciation of the Indians. In particular, when he was later questioned on being what was then the term of racist, a racialist, he actually believed, almost you can say, evoking the spirit of Julius Evola, that there were aspects of Indian culture which he even considered to be superior of that of Britain, were a conception of racialism simply to be adopted in the idea of racial superiority. But this segment should also demonstrate Powell's remarkable dexterity and realism when it came to his geopolitical assessments for Britain. The idea of Britain and Japan being allied as a counterbalance to the United States is hardly a fantasy. It was the policy of Britain during the first couple of decades of the 20th century, something that irked the Americans greatly. And one of Britain's, you can say, greatest blunders before World War II was abandoning that alliance with the Japanese. And indeed, Britain's policy directed towards Japan, continuing the war and allowing the Americans essentially to sweep them up, I believe did significant damage, perhaps more damage than anything else, in terms of the British being able to legitimate the presence of the empire. Because not only did the Japanese destroy much of British power in the Far East and take Singapore, which was the bastion of the British Empire in the Far East, its presence in the Pacific threatened Australia, but also the international settlements in China. It also awakened a form of anti-colonialism, which was stoked by the Japanese in the greater East Asia prosperity sphere. And moreover, it wedded these specific elements to America, no longer to Britain, because Britain could no longer adequately protect these outer sort of peripheries of the empire. So in all respects, in the long term, Enoch Powell was proven correct. That, in effect, that the United States became a Pacific hegemon after the war, and Japan was not only defeated by America, it was occupied and became an extension of the American empire, being able to face against the Chinese. So in all respects, you can say Powell's assessment in 1942 was apt in terms of being able to understand that Britain and its commitment to war alongside the United States effectively negated its power in relation to the United States in the long run. And this process of imperial negation was rapidly accelerated as a result of the British being unable to hold on to India. I question as to whether that was even possible given the state of India at the time. Um, I'm not really going to contrive a reason how that could have happened. That may be an interesting focus for another stream. But needless to say, this is something that Powell and Churchill actually held in common, albeit I believe, looking at this objectively, Powell had a greater strategic understanding as to how Britain could have held on to its eastern provinces as opposed to Churchill, which effectively amounts to wishful thinking. Powell's views were not that distinctive. There was a long-standing link between conservative, often termed Tory imperialism, and a design to check decline, and what they mean distinctive in terms of the abstract, not terms of the particular mechanism of getting there, which I've outlined. Until the early 1950s, many conservatives clung to the idea that the empire would allow Britain to compete with the United States. Contesting the 1950 general election in Wolverhampton, Powell argued, despite the loss of India for a greater imperial unity, with the merging and pooling of powers by its autonomous parts in those matters which concern them all, broadly understood to mean economic defense and foreign policy, Powell further identified the empire as a central part of the gulf which separates the fundamental beliefs of Tory and socialist. Powell argued that socialists saw the empire as imperialistic greed, operating at the expense of the workers, with national identity and sovereignty only perpetuated by the ruling classes and their own interests, and holding the misguided belief that the natural state of mankind was universal peace, possibly under some kind of world government. By contrast, at a relatively early stage in the Cold War, when it appeared that large parts of the world were first becoming increasingly polarized, he argued, and again this is Powell, it is the essence of Toryism to view the British nation as something natural and organic. From such a Britain, the Tory cannot look upon a world merely divided into democratic or communist, free or not free, Western or Eastern. He sees instead a wide scene peopled with various individual nations, obeying each the respective laws of their being. Nations to him, like national sovereignties, so far from being artificial barriers, are the inevitable framework within which mankind lives and associates. Crucially, he viewed the empire as the nation. He went on. The supreme boon which the British Empire confers upon its members, white and coloured alike, is a common sovereignty, which spans our world. Our mission towards the colonies is to educate them, not to independence, but to interdependence, to a more and more conscious and positive unity with the rest. Our mission towards the dominions is to find means whereby, in matters of general concern, our separate identities can still be sunk in common action. In its widest sense, the nation is an empire. So we don't mean empire in terms of being able to assimilate this into a nation proper, a multi-ethnic nation, but remaining, you can say, together and separated, nations coexisting within the broader conception of the British Empire as representing a macro nation, and this idea being founded, being anchored in the conception of raw power politics vis-a-vis the developed socialism of the Soviet Union or the liberal democracy of the United States. And it's interesting again seeing Powell refer to American democracy as something distinct from British democracy, not looking at these terms in the abstract, but looking at these terms in the particular and seeing British democracy, British sovereignty, British institutions as being distinct of that compared to the Americans. In one sense, Powell looked backwards in the late 19th century. Many advocates of a Greater Britain held hopes of creating in various ways a global nation based on the empire and possessing a common sovereignty. Yet Powell's wider position was very much a response to contemporary international politics. In a context where China had become communist and where Franco's regime in Spain appeared increasingly secure, Powell called for a national interest approach to foreign policy, understood as impossible to separate from imperial policy that eschewed ideology. Guided by its special aims and interests, the British Empire can and must cease to conduct foreign policy on an ideological basis. Jealous of our national evolution, one must respect that other countries, however different, with the internal politics of Spain and of China and even Russia herself, we have no business. Only our own essential interest gives us the right to range ourselves with or against another power. Britain is uniquely placed to break down the spurious bisection of mankind into two entrenched camps, which threatens a third world war. In terms of being able to conceive this in terms of buttressing Britain's power on the world stage, I can't help but feel perhaps the more apt analogy is not looking to Spain, but looking to Portugal. Portugal, which even though had a very particular conception of representative government wedded in the idea of corporatism, Portugal very much held that the sovereignty of Portugal vis-a-vis America in particular would be held up by the preservation of its colonies, Angola and Mozambique, and other colonies such as Goa, East Timor, being wedded to this idea of Portuguese sovereignty. So perhaps there is a kernel of Salazar in Powell's thinking. But it's also interesting to think of this as a response to Britain's decline to hold on to the empire. You can look at the continuation of national service after the war and the response to the Malayan emergency as aspects of that. But you can say more fundamentally, this is in stark contrast to some sort of proactive desire to create an imperial parliament, or you can say the contrived means, which I believe were facets of getting Britain involved in the First World War, which I discuss in my video, Why Britain Went to War. why Britain entered the First World War, where I contend that many elements of the Conservative Party and the colonial administrators in particular were focused on finding an enemy with which to consolidate Britain into a national identity. Powell is looking at this from the opposite end, that we've seen the cataclysm of 2 world wars, and now it is a matter of holding on to Britain's last vestiges of power, which can cement it as a sovereign nation, as an extension of the empire. Yet signs of change within Powell's thought were gradually apparent. Within the One Nation group in 1951, Powell acknowledged that the 19th century empire was overblown, and he called for a pragmatic assessment of what features and parts of it remain essential, and what must be done to restore confidence and prestige. In 1952, Powell expressed his public unease about the emergence of the British Commonwealth, which had been formally constituted 3 years earlier, and growing decolonisation, as an association of free and equal former members of the empire, with the British monarch as its symbolic head. Powell took specific aim at what he saw as the nonsense of the Conservative policy of self-government within it, arguing that if a territory is autonomous, then presumably its own government has the power to alter the relation of that country to any other in the world. In 1953, he dismissed the title of the head of the Commonwealth as essentially a sham in Parliament. Now, I can't help feeling on a personal note, this is sort of veering away from the historical conversation, very much this echoing my own sentiments regarding the head of the Commonwealth position when I was talking recently on the ideological facets of Charles's monarchy, King Charles's monarchy, and that of the head of the Commonwealth being a multinational contrivance, which has now superseded the idea of retaining some link to the British monarchy in the round as representing an extension of British sovereignty, which is why the monarchy is supposed to exist. And indeed, you can say that Powell is foreseeing elements of the negation of the institution of monarchy, not just in terms of its relationship to the former elements of the empire, but the institution itself as becoming a sham. And when he's looking at autonomy, he seems to be looking at autonomy within a very specific context. On the one hand, autonomy means being able to pursue an independent foreign policy. It's interesting to see how Powell will be able to take the idea of autonomy and regard it to aspects of domestic politics, which, of course, the empire did not have a uniform administration, especially if one looks at India. The Empire of India had a very specific form of administration. Within it, say, for example, the Maharaja, say, for example, the Sultan of Hyderabad, couldn't go around and form an alliance with Nazi Germany if he wanted. But that, in essence, would represent an aspect whereby there was local autonomy, local government, but that didn't represent the autonomy to go around and form alliances with powers that would be antithetical to Britain's interests. So within that, again, this is consistent with Powell's thinking. Yet there is another aspect to this, which is the transition from subject to citizen. Citizen, of course, denoting some sort of absence or break from fealty to the British sovereign. If British sovereignty and allegiance to the British sovereign, who is the monarch, the king, emperor, until the independence of India, is supposed to elicit a sense of obedience and connection to the motherland, then with citizen, you are seeing a new conception of the relationship, which is founded on a democracy, and what Powell would consider a foreign form of democracy, a democracy which isn't consistent with the eternal values of the ancient British liberty, in terms of being able to find nuance with all of these terms, which I find very interesting. Indeed, there is a specific example, which I'll bring up here, which is the example of Canada in 1946 taking this dramatic route, which even preceded the creation of the Commonwealth by a few years. If anything, he believed that this was the first stepping stone towards a radical reappraisal of the relationship between the dominions and the mother country. And indeed, it should be referenced within Powell on Fighting a Losing Battle that this was a process that had been underway for a good 20 years by the time of 1954, especially with the Imperial conferences, which would later become the Commonwealth conferences, regarding the equal status of the white dominions, and later on continuing to extend to all of what would later be the nations of the empire, later Commonwealth. So here we get to the situation with Suez. Now, have I lost my segment here? Bear with me. No, I haven't. Even so, in 1953, Powell joined the Suez group of about 40 backbench MPs who sought to maintain military control amid local political instability over the Suez Canal in Egypt that was owned by a joint Anglo-French company and was a very important British trading route between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. I think Corthorn actually understates here how important the Suez Canal was. It was essential in terms of linking the Far East, East Africa with the Mediterranean, as indeed Gibraltar was significant. Gibraltar and the Suez Canal represented the two gateways into the Mediterranean, and the fact that Britain controlled this was inextricably linked, I would say, to Britain's position as a global superpower. So just to re-emphasize that. Like others in the group, Powell view was that the US foreign policy, was relentlessly directed towards the weakening and destruction of the links which bind the British Empire together. He was also fearful that Britain would have ceased to be a great power if it proved unable to stand up in Egypt, a midget power, and lost control of a vital strategic area. In a wider sense, Powell was concerned that no one should imagine that the rot will stop here, because nothing less than the entire British position in Eastern and Central Africa is at stake. In July of 1954, Powell was one of 26 Conservative MPs to vote against the government when the Suez Agreement, by which Britain would withdraw from the Canal Zone, was debated in the House of Commons. Again, fighting an uphill struggle and being essentially at odds with the establishment both of the Labour governments and the Conservative government, which was that of a managed decline, and this would colour the particular perspective in relationship to the actual Suez crisis here. Because Powell's views were publicly about to change. Addressing the summer school of the Conservative Political Centre, the party's political education body in 1954, Powell argued that the unstable compromise of imperial government by the Parliament of Great Britain had rested on power, on Great Britain's ability to give the colonies security and peace unaided. When this was shattered by the First World War, and with dominions including Australia, New Zealand, and Canada increasingly dependent, Powell considered that this starkly exposed differences in the political institutions of the United Kingdom and the character of its former and present dependencies, making its disintegration inevitable, with the only surprise being that it had taken so long. Powell now saw the process gathering momentum and became increasingly fraught because of the existence within the British dominions of large populations unconnected in origin with the United Kingdom and potentially antipathetic to its to it by tradition or by race. Against this backdrop, the formal conclusion of the Suez Agreement in October 1904 proved pivotal. Powell left the Suez Group the following month. He now argued Britain and also the Conservative Party have now to rethink their foreign policy and what used to be their imperial policy on new premises. Territories and positions that had a value as part of the worldwide system may in isolation have no value or less than no value. The Suez Agreement showed decisively that Britain was no longer able or willing, there was no real difference, to maintain the world system at one or at various points, if that means the exertion of force. Despite his stance, Powell, as he later told a Labour politician, Tony Benn, watched with amused detachment at the outbreak of hysteria as Prime Minister Anthony Eden faced Conservative calls for a vigorous response to the nationalisation of the canal by the new Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, defying the terms of the Suez Agreement, under which the Suez Canal Company was not due to return to the Egyptian government until 1968. Considering that any British action had come 2 years too late to be effective, Powell privately did not approve of an Anglo-French invasion of Egypt, ostensibly as peacemakers, but later to be revealed to be in collusion with the State of Israel, that prompted domestic and international outcry and financial pressure from the United States led to unconditional withdrawal. Frankly, he didn't think it was right or could be successful to attempt to invade and get back what had already been lost. This is very significant because it is, again, you can say, a concession to what had already occurred. The First World War had, I believe, a certain element within the First World War sort of advocacy lobby in terms of finding some contrived way of finding a war with Germany, had believed that the First World War would unite the British Empire. Of course, the result was the complete opposite. In the same way that Churchill, ostensibly, his political program was the defense of the empire, the Second World War ended up rapidly accelerating its decline. And what Powell here is acknowledging is the reality on the ground. You have a government which is pusillanimous, a government which is unwilling to defend the empire, a government which is entering into agreements which are contrary to its interests, and a government effectively that is leading to a situation where it has become more costly and therefore more difficult to hold on to the imperial possessions. Again, going back to my Gorbachev stream, you can say the rationale here in terms of a loss of confidence, a loss in legitimacy, and also you can say the growing costs of empire vis-a-vis any strategic gains that Britain's going to make here is very similar to how the Soviet Union saw the Warsaw Pact after 1968, a growing burden, and you can say a source of a loss of prestige in terms of the Soviet Union only being able to hold on to these dominions essentially by force. If the British situation is to be contrived in the same way, then Britain could only maintain its presence in the empire by holding on to it by force. But again, Powell is looking at this as the preserve of incredibly weak men at the head of the Conservative Party who are operating this policy. And there is, of course, an aspect of I told you so. When we look at the situation in Suez, Powell could see what was going to happen in 1954 when Britain decided to withdraw from Suez, only for Britain to decide when the inevitable happened and Egypt nationalized the canal, that Britain then would attempt to remilitarize and seize back the canal, essentially what was lost. So in many ways, this represented an omnishambles within all respects for Powell in terms of being able to see this within the grand scheme of the decline of the British Empire. So looking at the end of the British Empire, I think this is a good example to come to the new world order that Powell is having to confront, the transition from empire and being able to find Britain's position in the world, essentially, where we have regressed or contracted to the idea of the rump, the nation state of Great Britain. And this represents another breach between Powell and the Conservative Party, because now Powell is desiring to restrict Britain's role in the world. And this argument grows out of his views about the end of empire, in which he articulated in terms of the operation of the balance of power. Crucially, it also involved Powell's offering his opinion on what was fast becoming a major international issue: US military intervention in Vietnam. Amid French withdrawal from Indochina, the United States has sent military advisors to the area as early as 1950, but their numbers had only increased dramatically from 1961. In 1964, the US Congress authorized military action against North Vietnam, with the first heavy bombing raids beginning the following year. Against this backdrop, Powell argued that Southeast Asia had posed the post-colonial problem of Europe, in Asia, and Africa in an absolute classic form. The colonial government withdrew, or was driven out. The successor government proves too unstable to resist aggression or subversion by communists, and the danger of communist advance is then felt by Western powers, and particularly by America, to outweigh the dangers of involvement. Yet Western support weakens the successor regime still further by making it dependent and laying it open to the charge that in the stooge of imperialism. Thus, the West is drawn deeper and deeper into the politics as well as the defense of the country concerned. At last, the choice has to be made. One alternative is openly to fight a war against internal and external communism, so initially govern the country in order to do so. The other alternative is to cut one's losses and clear out, leaving events to take their course. This is the choice which now stares America in the face in Vietnam. If the Americans decided for the latter alternative, a similar choice would probably soon confront Britain and Malaya. Contraction of the imperial position, being wedded to this notion of, you can say, a retrenchment in foreign policy, that the only way of holding on to these possessions by war. And going back to what was said earlier regarding a nation is a subjective quality in the sense that a nation can only exist so long as the denizens believe that they are a part of a nation. A nation is representing many facets, but also a nation representing a psychic reality. A nation is representing a facet in history. So you can say that Powell's thinking is stemming from the psychic break in terms of the decolonization efforts and the loss of a British legitimacy in the empire. Now, this would extend to all policies regarding US and containment and all attempts to hold on or to buttress regimes, instead opting for this idea of accepting the inevitable and cutting one's losses, being able to judge what is essentially in the interests of Britain by not becoming too involved within domestic politics, even at the result of facilitating warfare. And as it so happens, I do have a discussion on the situation in Vietnam. Not necessarily in complete agreement regarding his views on Vietnam, up until 1963 at least. Powell's stance rested on the argument that the boundary line between communism and non-communism, pitting his views within the context of the Cold War, may appear to be fixed by the balance of military force in some one place at some one moment. In reality, it will represent a worldwide balance of forces, not military, but economic, political, and human. It could be that in the absence of the Americans, the communists would not necessarily prevail in Vietnam. The resultant regrouping of forces in Southeast Asia and elsewhere would prove a stronger, not a weaker obstacle to the further expansion of communist power. At a point when he was about to be appointed Shadow Defense Minister, Powell's argument went against a decree of cross-party consensus, which emphasized the importance of maintaining and even increasing Britain's presence east of the Suez at the expense of Britain's commitment to Germany, where the Soviet threat was perceived to have lessened. This was the line adopted by the government in February of 1965 and in Conservative Party policy, which was published for the party conference in 1965. At the conference itself, Powell took issue with this perspective. He now asserted that Western Europe was central to British defensive policy following the dissolution of the empire, recognizing that mutual antagonism between the Soviet Union and China, the Sino-Soviet split, which had emerged publicly since 1961, undermined the notion of a monolithic communist threat. Powell argued that among the new independent countries in Asia and Africa, the eventual limits of Russian and Chinese advance will be fixed by the balance of forces, which will itself be Asiatic and African, and whose attainment could be delayed rather than hastened by Western military presence. Powell prompted debate, but Conservative Party policy remained committed to a presence east of Suez. This continued to be the case even after the Labour government committed in 1967 to the British to withdraw from the Far East, with Singapore base, including the Singapore base by the mid-1970s. So again, how can we understand this in terms of Powell's policy? Well, we've gone from empire and we are now going to the British home islands. Western Europe, thereby, is the buffer between the Soviet Empire, ostensibly, if we're going to label that as the true enemy, and the security of the home islands. What does it therefore serve Britain in terms of the overall conflict in the Cold War by maintaining a financially ruinous position in the Far East, maintaining these bases, ultimately to the benefit of the Americans? Powell's argument here, in terms of non-intervention, is that these nations should be left to themselves. There are already internal contradictions within the foreign policy of these nations being exposed: Vietnam against communist China against the USSR, and rather than attempting essentially to unite these forces by sustained military intervention that was proven to be disastrous in Vietnam, Powell was opting for a position of non-interference, and that would essentially be, again, antithetical to the US policy of containment. But again, this would also stem from Powell's idea that Britain has no obligation simply to exert a foreign policy in line with US stated goals as an extension of the US empire. Powell's perspective, indeed, referring to this, was underpinned by criticisms of Britain's relationship with the United States. In spring of 1966, as part of an attack on the Labour government, Powell argued that Britain had lost the ability to distinguish between an ally and a satellite, or between a friend and a lackey. Powerfully, Powell argued that as US involvement in Vietnam had increased, Britain's voice had been that of an obedient commentator, bitingly adding that the Soviet Union could hardly have been expected a more favourable comment from its satrapies in Eastern Europe, referring to the Warsaw Pact, of course. Provocatively, Powell suggested that there could be a contingency plan for sending at least a token British force to Vietnam. This was denied flatly by Dennis Healey, who was a Labour minister at the time. Wilson was in fact continuing the policy adopted by the Conservative government, offering moral support to the United States and providing military training for the South Vietnamese army that was backed by the United States. The Wilson government also clandestinely sold arms to the United States, including napalm. Yet juggling pressure from within this cabinet, from the parliamentary party and the rank and file, with a commitment to maintaining good Anglo-American relations, Wilson resisted strong US pressure to join the war effort in any form. And again, on a personal note, I will actually say that one point alone makes Wilson the best prime minister we've had in the post-war, as controversial as that may sound. Meanwhile, Powell also seized on the opportunity created by the French questioning of the structure and organization of NATO, which soon led to France's withdrawal from NATO's military structure to cast doubt on a core part of the Anglo-American relationship. If France can leave and France can assert its own interests within the context of the American alliance, essentially why is Britain operating under the role of lackey? This, of course, is under the presidency of Charles de Gaulle. In the Korean War, as early as the 1950s, NATO had an integrated military command under the direction of the United States. As recently as 1966, Powell had told his colleagues on the LCC that there was no advantage for the opposition in opening the subject up in the public or at the stage thinking aloud about the future of NATO. Now, however, he publicly asserted that in spite of opposition from Washington, there was a need to restudy the future of that organization with minds afresh. As he responded to the crisis in southern Rhodesia, arguing against any further British involvement, this is modern Zimbabwe, the full implications of Powell's position became apparent. Southern Rhodesia had been a self-governing crown colony since 1923. In November of 1965, Ian Smith's white-dominated government made a unilateral declaration of independence as Rhodesia, without British approval, when northern Rhodesia achieved independence as Zambia. This upset that the UK would not move to independence without a majority, i.e. black majority rule. In Britain, the reaction was formidable and saw calls for sanctions on southern Rhodesia. Yet Powell argued that it was too important to accept the extent of our real power today in Central Africa, and to recognize the evolution of events in southern Rhodesia is no longer ours to dictate. While Smith had supported from the so-called Rhodesia lobby, notably the Conservative peer Lord Salisbury and the Conservative MP Patrick Wall, the UK, the Commonwealth and the UN condemned the UDI as illegal and imposed economic sanctions. Powell was thus pitted against the majority view, but he chose a meeting of the Monday Club, the Conservative pressure group formed in 1961 in opposition to decolonisation, to set out his position in grand terms of abating decline, connecting a state of national dejection to the failure to appreciate the importance of geography and specifically distance, with the Monday Club providing an organisational home for many of those supportive of the Smith regime, Ian Smith being the leader of Rhodesia. Powell directly challenged its core imperialist belief. Our present sense of inferiority, that being Britain's, is closely linked with our inability or reluctance to concentrate in the areas of our national strength, the Atlantic and the Western Europe, that referring to the home islands. By late 1968, he was arguing coldly in favour of recognising that Rhodesia is an independent, albeit foreign country, having become so successfully by rebellion. The following year, as it appeared likely that Rhodesia would declare itself a republic, meaning that it would abandon its professed loyalty to the crown that it maintained after the unilateral declaration of independence, Powell not only called for an end to economic sanctions, but also made a broader argument about why he considered intervention to be untenable. There are equal or greater numbers of people around the world who detest and abhor forms of government which prevail in Russia and the other communist countries of Eastern Europe. The world will become a madhouse if nations which dislike the manner in which others are governed take that as a reason for trying to starve or blockade or bully them into changing to their persecutor's satisfaction. Now, this should come as quite a surprise in the context of United States foreign policy, which is that democracy is God, and God stated that democracy will be spread all over the world, and everyone will be happy, liberal, and gay and prosperous and all that crap, which was basically the mantra of the neocons and the justification for the Iraq War, among many other conflicts, including conflicts going on today. But to use this colloquially, and I mean colloquially in a very qualified sense, this is Westphalian. The idea that power politics and international relations should be predicated based on states as they exist, irrespective of their internal political situation. People familiar with the channel will know the gripes I have with the term Westphalian, but using it within this broad understanding, Powell's essentially advocating again for a realist position And indeed, you can say that Britain's position and that of the Commonwealth's position is fundamentally ideological. Seeing, of course, that majority rule has worked so well in all other places in Africa, Britain and the United States, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth will only accept that situation existing in Rhodesia. Their policy, you can say, is democratic in the extreme or even anti-white racism. However, Powell's argument, you can say, based on the indictments given against him regarding stirring up racial hatred, you would have thought that Powell would have been advocating for Rhodesia based on the qualification of white minority government, when in fact that is not the case at all. Powell is arguing for this based on the fact that this is not our fight. Rhodesia is now presented as a fact. Why do we have such an investment in undermining the legitimacy of the government in Rhodesia and bringing about majority government at all costs? Just something to consider. Now, this also underpins the idea that Powell really is only focused on the relationships of power. Power in terms of what countries can emanate and in terms of posing a threat to Britain, and that soft power, ideological arguments can of course be used with regards to internal politics, but they should not necessarily inform how Britain does business with other nations. Rhodesia, of course, is one example, but the far more pivotal example within this situation is that of the Soviet Union. Of course, the idea that Britain could form an alliance with the Soviet Union seems antithetical to people who have a very blinkered conception of the Cold War as capitalism versus communism, as democracy versus socialist autocracy, and aspects such as that. But Powell, you can say, is viewing the Soviet Union as a fact and viewing the Soviet Union as Russia. In that sense, Russia and the United States must be judged in terms of their respective benefits they can offer the United Kingdom in foreign policy and what respective threats they pose to it. Gradually, Powell's perspective was beginning to change as he came to see shifts in the global and European balance of power, clearing the way for Britain and Russia to become potential allies. Powell's position was based primarily on the premise that Russia did not pose a threat to Western Europe. In the mid-1950s, Powell had stated that he did not believe that Russia seriously expects to be able to embody a reunited Germany in her own empire, large as its Russian stomach. It is not big enough to digest Germany. Indeed, the argument which I've consistently advocated for and is borne out by all the evidence is that Russia had no interest in conquering parts of Western Europe, namely West Germany, but had an interest in securing a united Germany as a neutral no man's land between NATO and the Warsaw Pact buffer states. In 1969, Powell articulated his argument more fully. In part, it was underpinned by a strategic awareness that a Soviet offensive against Western Europe would mean war, not nuclear war, but just war with America and Britain, and Russia would feel no certainty she would win that war, even if she overran the whole of Europe. More fundamentally, however, Powell suggested that it was a mistake to believe that Russia wants Western Europe, on the basis that Russian aims and ambitions in Eastern Europe are no guide to Russian aims and ambitions in Western Europe. Powell added in East Germany that Russians are already holding a wolf by the ears. The last thing they desire is to quadruple that danger by a conquest which would include their orbit, not a fragment of Germany, but the entire German people. In essence, he understands the reality that the Warsaw Pact was in many ways a liability for the Soviet Union. Strategically, they believed it was a necessity, not necessarily for the expansion of communism, but in terms of being able to create a buffer zone between the Soviet Union proper and the nations operating under the United States and NATO. So, taking that into perspective, why would the Soviet Union overextend itself by trying to engage in a war of expansion when it is essentially adopting a defensive posture, which you could almost say which is consistent with that of the Soviet Union existing as a Russian empire, as a Russian state, focusing on Russian interest, the preservation of the Russian homeland, and creating satrapies around it for which to forestall any potential attack. Powell did not, however, endorse détente, a relaxation of international tension, which as a policy reached its high point in the early 1970s, as it was pursued by the United States, initially under Nixon and his influential national security advisor and subsequently Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. This was the era of the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, Conservative opposition to faith in Tétant increased from the mid-1970s, with the argument increasingly made by Margaret Thatcher, as Conservative leader, that the Soviet Union was actually taking the opportunity to increase its military forces. Powell's argument rested more explicitly on his realist interpretation of international balance of power politics. As such, it pitted him against some of the strongest supporters of Détente, often found in the Labour Party, who saw it as a means of reforming international relations and of bringing the Cold War to an end. Powell explained, all states live in a condition of balance which assumes tension. The tension may be excessive or dangerous, but it only becomes dangerous when the balance is disturbed. What we ought to be looking for at all time, what is the business of international statesmanship, is, in my view, as a person who believes there are such things as nations, is to maintain that balance which will prevent tension, either breaking or being so relaxed that an entirely new structure is called for a risk of violence. Clearly, there are circumstances in which naval agreements, military agreements will save both parties money without altering their pursuit of their respective interests. Are common sense, and then we'll have them. But what I'm complaining of is calling these things détente, as though by such arrangements as radical change in the nature of international relations, or an elimination of some of the persistent and permanent tensions between states will take place. Powell also positioned himself against a powerful critique of the Soviet Union, emanating from liberal and labor circles, which increasingly emphasized human rights abuses in the communist world, with particular concern for the treatment of political dissidents. Human rights, emphasizing individual freedom, rose to prominence in the years after 1945, with a commitment to them established in the UN Commission on Human Rights. With the West's rhetorical embrace of them placed against the Soviet bloc's commitment to wider collective rights relating to broader economic and social goals, human rights became a key battleground of the Cold War. From the mid-1970s, a concern that human rights were being overlooked amid the quest for détente developed in both the United States and UK, and played a part in prompting Jimmy Carter from 1977 to make a search for them as an important element of his appeal. At the same time, détente and human rights became formally linked, forming part of the 1975 East-West Helsinki Agreement. Powell's objection to human rights went right to the heart of his views on national sovereignty. He held that a human being per se have no rights because all rights are the converse of obligations, between human beings in a society. In other words, he believes in the idea of reciprocation. Implicit in this idea is the idea of social contract, and conducive to these points will be an idea of nationalism as contingent on particularism, existing within nation states, not universal things to be considered and necessary things to be imposed. He considered that there was no such thing as society in general, but there are only societies in particular. I wonder if Margaret Thatcher took that quote and got the wrong impression. Powell's view was that all international conventions to recognize human rights involve the cessation of sovereignty. That is, they imply the transfer to an external authority of the power to secure enforcement of its decrees inside respective states. With the Moscow-Helsinki group set up to monitor Soviet compliance with the agreement, including the commitment to human rights, Powell also made it clear that this undertaking was fundamentally at odds with how he viewed the nature of international relations. He considered it futile to attempt to bring about radical alteration of the way in which the Russians treat its nationals. The Russian state treats its nationals because, in the final resort, it would always act in its own interests. In other words, the futility of believing that the Soviet Union would kindly go about and implementing the moral arguments of the West for them. In early 1979, Powell argued that with an almost geological inevitability, the power balance of the nations of the world had begun to shift. He saw an important expression of it in the rapprochement of the United States with China, not just China, but a China which appears to be now positively seeking a role of superstar on the world stage. The process had begun in the early 1970s. Powell argued that this alignment could not but release a chain reaction with the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, and a combination of North America, Western Europe, and the new China. Powell states here, we must start from the assumption that the antithesis between the USA and the USSR is fundamental. As polar neighbors, as technological competitors on the highest plane, and as mutual uncomprehending ideologies, if Western Europe and China are both to be placed in the American pan of balance, it must follow that America and Europe in the Western Hemisphere, and between America and China in the Eastern Hemisphere, a counterpoise will also be called into existence by sheer necessity. The result of following this reasoning through it to produce a picture which is historically familiar in the West and more novel in the East. Historically, the existence of Russia has been the ultimate guarantee of the survival of Britain as an independent nation. By this in reference to Germany and France in 1812, in 1914, and in 1942. Russia has always been for Britain the greatest power out beyond her continental enemy. The only nation possessing the inexhaustible resources of manpower and reserves of space which render her superior to any land army in ability to survive. The fundamental fact of geopolitics has nothing to do with political or any other kind of affinity, when in the last decades of the 20th century, necessity restores an understanding between Britain and Russia. The Entente will not be cordial, but Entente it will still be. But what of Europe's aspect? What of the Europe of the Eastern aspect? The rise of China aduberates for Japan a relation with the Asiatic Russia, but radically different from that of Britain with European Russia. Powell's argument for an alliance with the Soviet Union was a radical one to make. Hostility to the Soviet Union and an embrace of the Anglo-American relationship ran deep in the conservative circles and had recently been energized under Thatcher, who devoted considerable effort to developing stronger relations with the United States and had taken pains to warn of the continuing and even growing Soviet threat. Yet with Thatcher in government after May of 1979, Powell made clear his criticism of her foreign policy in practice. Shortly after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979, Powell repeated his argument that Russia did not have any desire to invade Western Europe. He also made clear his opposition to taking any kind of retaliatory action against the Soviet Union, including the proposed boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which Thatcher followed US President Carter in endorsing, but that in the British case she was unable to achieve. Powell dismissed the boycott on the basis that the judgment of the Russian depend not upon words or upon professions, which have only to be examined to be seen to be hollow, but upon the estimates of real power and real intentions. His own view, however, was that Britain should not have reacted at all. The unfolding of the Falklands War in 1982 brought a significant reconciliation with Thatcher, but only intensified Powell's desire to speak against the US alliance. Following the Argentine invasion in April of the British overseas territory in South Atlantic, over which it claimed sovereignty, Powell was invited to discuss the conflict with the Prime Minister as the only Privy Councillor representing a Northern Ireland constituency. Powell praised Thatcher's decision swiftly to dispatch a naval task force and later to launch an amphibious assault. Yet he took issue with the proposition that Britain was now obeying the orders of the United Nations, whose Security Council had passed Resolution 502 demanding immediate Argentine withdrawal. In other words, he believes that the response to the invasion of the Falklands should be that of a nation responding to a hostile attack by a foreign power and not simply facilitated as an agent of international law. He now dismissed the United Nations as institutionalism, not of law, international or any other, but of the existing constellations of real power. Powell had been critical of the UN since the early 1950s, but it was only after the 1970s they attacked its fundamental contradiction, taking as its basis the sovereign, self-conscious nation, but ignoring the fact that the very nature and existence of nations itself are inseparable from force. Powell argued that Britain had acted in her own right and on her own behalf, and had acted because she was a naval power, threatened in her own maritime element. As far back as 1969, Powell had identified the strategic importance of the Falklands in enabling Britain to give battle and exercise surveillance far out into the Atlantic. With the Argentine surrender, Powell subsequently praised the victory as a demonstration of British power and the will to use it. He made much of the fact that the war was one which the United States obviously did not want Britain to fight. There was an initial US concern that Argentina would ask the Soviet Union for support, and there was an early attempt to mediate to end the conflict, but the Argentinians refused US peace initiatives. The United States ultimately sided with the UK, providing military equipment and prohibiting arms sales to Argentina. For Powell, This ushered in a great liberation when the scales fell from the eyes of the British public and they beheld the United States not in fairy tale disguise, sustained so seductively since 1942, but as the nation really divergent from Britain in its interests, attitudes, and intentions, and neither friend nor foe to the country, except as its perception of American advantage and American purpose dictates. By the middle of 1992, Powell had developed his position into a full-blown critique of the New World Order, a term that had gained increasing usage to describe the hegemonic position of the United States. He argued that this had originated in the United States at the time of the Gulf War and did immense damage as the United States, wearing the mask of the United Nations, persuaded us to repel the invasion of Kuwait, this is in 1990, an independent state by Iraq, another independent state. He argued that a further development had taken place as the UN made a flagrant and unjustifiable attempt to intervene in the international affairs of Yugoslavia, and thus had become a self-contradiction. Powell once again explicitly linked Britain's relationship with the United States to decline. Despite his hopes about US demise, he was now as pessimistic as during the Cold War, and with pressure on the UK to adopt a peacekeeping role, he argued that much of our present malaise arises from the subject of subordination to America and American purposes. He is fundamentally reacting, and you can say this is the final confirmation of the threat of America now established by a unipolar order. But I want again to relate this back to Gorbachev. Powell had long argued that the Soviet Union had no interest in gobbling up the states of Western Europe, in particular Germany, and that in itself justified the continued American presence in Europe. When Gorbachev comes about and he begins his new thinking with regards to foreign policy, perestroika, not just an extension of Soviet internal politics, but external politics, ideology being essentially linked throughout all facets of the Soviet regime in all aspects of policy. The Soviets begin a process of withdrawal from their eastern satrapies, as Powell would call them, the states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, and Bulgaria. For Powell, this forms a complete vindication, but not a vindication in terms of the overestimation by the Americans of the Soviet threat. Moreover, however, he views this as an opportunity to see Gorbachev as a way to counteract American power. Gorbachev becoming less of an entrenched ideological opponent, Gorbachev representing less of a threat to Britain's interests in Western Europe, in particular the Benelux and France, and someone essentially who can offer an alternative to an American unipolar world. Indeed, this is what Thatcher believed that Gorbachev was fundamentally doing from 1986, that Gorbachev's policy seemed designed to elicit favorable support within Europe and the wider world. Some person actually commenting on my previous video said that the idealized form of Gorbachev's foreign policy aims were focused on creating a myriad of Finland scenarios. Finland that was technically within the Soviet orbit since the end of World War II, but was an independent, non-occupied democratic socialist regime. Within this context, you can say that Gorbachev believed that Enoch Powell believed that Gorbachev essentially could be a partner to Britain and not simply a partner to the United States. So you can probably understand his frustration and misery that by 1990 through to 1992, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that such dreams of being able to establish a counterbalance which wasn't so ideologically and vehemently in tension with the United Kingdom could not come to pass. And he sees this in terms of the development of overall US foreign policy. In that segment, we see the examples brought up of Kuwait and also the examples brought up of Yugoslavia. The unipolar moment, the fact that NATO will not, say, for example, withdraw its troops from Germany, the fact that NATO will only ultimately expand alongside the European Union into the former elements of the Warsaw Pact, despite the existence of NATO supposedly being predicated on a post-war alliance and sustained by activity during the Cold War, and the fact that the United States is now getting involved in terms of internal political strife regarding Yugoslavia, the war between Croatia and the state of Yugoslavia essentially been captured by Serbs, and indeed between conflicts of other powers which are of no sort of have no direct sort of effect on the overall strategic picture of the United Kingdom with regard to Iraq invading Kuwait. So within all aspects of foreign policy, with Powell focused on British sovereignty vis-a-vis the Americans in particular, and you can almost say becoming more paranoid regarding the Americans, the Falklands War is an isolated episode in this whole scheme within a overall feeling of decline. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, you can say that this is the final defeat of Powellism or British realism, or really any aspect of an independent British foreign policy as far as Powell is concerned. But this brings an interesting point regarding his view of the United Nations, the inherent contradictions of the United Nations, and the fact of the United Nations as simply exhibiting a legalized sort of emanation of quote unquote international law, which is in reality enforced by hard power realities, that being the hard power potential of the United States. So it's only therefore natural to lead this conversation rather sort of conveniently over to Powell's views on the European Union. Until the end of the 1960s, Powell viewed issues about Europe in terms of, and again for reference, I mean, I'm sure that people in the chat are aware of this, but another reason why Powell has been brought up, perhaps extensively in the last 8 years, is the victory of Brexit. Even though Brexit has effectively been neutered and subverted beyond all recognition now, to the point, why do we even bother having it? Brexit is intimately associated with the legacy of Powell essentially being the most succinct and effective advocate against the European Union. And this, of course, is in the context where he opposed Britain's initial entry into the organization in the 1970s. Until the end of the 1960s, Powell viewed issues about Europe in terms of, among other areas we have already examined, international relations and economics. He had, however, already fluctuated in his opinions. In 1950, as the Labour government rejected the French ultimatum to decide promptly whether to join the European coal and steel community, Powell was one of the 6 Conservative MPs who abstained when the Conservative Party opposed the government's decision. The overall Conservative position was based on the acceptance of European unity as a check against communism, a view that aligned it with the United States. Powell's concern was the empire. He was opposed to any pooling of sovereignty with the European countries, which would automatically result in severing her from non-European countries of the empire. He further argued that unlike the countries of the continent, Britain's main defence obligations lay at that time overseas in the countries of the empire or those bordering upon it. Subsequent events moved quickly, but Powell's attention was elsewhere. With the United Kingdom standing aloof, the 6 Western European states already in the European coal and steel community convened at Messina in Sicily in 1955 and argued to form the European Economic Community with a common market and customs union enacted by the Treaty of Rome. After the Conservative government under Harold Macmillan applied for membership of this new European grouping, Powell embraced economic arguments in favour of joining, i.e. free trade economic arguments. Powell was very much a devotee of Hayek. I consider myself a friend of academic agent. I hope he does so. Even we've had some back and forth on Twitter recently regarding the Napoleonic Wars. But regardless, he very much uses Hayek as basically the sanitized, publicly accessible iteration of hardcore Austrian economics, something essentially equivocating an equivalency essentially between, or halfway house between Miltonite Chicago school economics and the Austrian school. But he was very much enamored with Constitution and Liberty and the Road to Serfdom, which he read in the 1940s and 50s. This is part of the reason why the Labour Party, especially in the 1980s, opposed becoming part of the European Union, seeing it as a free market conspiracy. And indeed, you can say in terms of Powell's initial thinking, there is a bit of friction here regarding the European Union as something conducive to the overall strategic aims of the United States and Western Europe, something which very much still exists today, and the idea of Britain being able to benefit economically from greater participation, the idea that Britain is fundamentally a maritime trading nation and that free trade and having more trading partners is fundamentally in its interests. After the Conservative government under Harold Macmillan applied for membership of this new European grouping, Powell embraced economic arguments in favour of joining and used them to attack Labour. With the government keen to benefit from a shift in British trading patterns away from the Empire and towards Western Europe in the previous decade, Powell criticised Labour's dithering and ambivalence at a time when the party was divided over membership. Powell's assault on Labour continued even after the French President de Gaulle vetoed the UK application in January of 1963. Developing his case for a free economy, Powell argued that Labour's main priority, in contrast, was to keep our economy sufficiently insulated from the outside world to be in the control of the national planners, which was the root of their antagonism to the common market. Significantly, Powell was also dismissive of those in the Conservative Party. Significantly, Powell was also dismissive of those, sorry, I read that bit, such as in the Conservative Party, such as Victor Montague, who argued that British membership would damage trade with the Commonwealth. Back in 1950, Powell had himself sought to prioritize trade with the Empire, but having argued that the Empire's breakup was now inevitable and that the Commonwealth was a pretense, he now blasted the numerically diminishing grouping which remained irreconcilably opposed to European alignment and still worships at the deserted shrine of the Commonwealth preference. Powell's overall view was that there was a recognition across the board of the potential benefits of British membership, from industry anticipating increased trade, from agriculture expecting to flourish under the managed prices of the agricultural policy, and from the public that was becoming to perceive the advantages of the large European market. Importantly, at this stage, Powell sought to minimize concerns about the diminution of British sovereignty. During a House of Commons debate over the UK application, the Conservative Derek Walker-Smith, the former Minister of Health, had explicitly argued that the European political opinion, which he held to be the long-term goal, would undermine sovereignty. On the Labour side, Douglas Jay, Michael Foot and Peter Shaw soon echoed similar concerns. From his involvement in the Shadow Cabinet in 1965 as Shadow Transport Minister, before becoming Shadow Defence Minister, in the summer, Powell could have been in little doubt that the common market was regarded as a political and military as well as an economic grouping. Yet he argued the instinctive resistance of the British to anything which would limit their treasured independence and national sovereignty has been much softened. They have become accustomed to the notion that the decisions of the international bodies on which Britain is represented, but which she does not control, might be accepted without abandoning their pride that Britain shall never be slaves, which I would say is by far the most cynical view one can have. Powell saw membership of the European Economic Community as a means of checking Britain's economic and internal decline. Powell had, of course, taken issue with what he saw as fixation on competing British economic performance unfavourably with that of other, especially Western European states. Yet while he disagreed with the left-wing analysis of the economists, Andrew Schoenfield and Michael Shanks, with their calls for more state planning, he agreed with them at this stage that it would be economically beneficial to join the community, albeit on the basis that this would facilitate greater competition. Arguing that it was necessary to see the outside world changing, Powell argued that Europe, regarded economically rather than politically, is the greatest industrial and technical power in the world, capable of challenging the Russo-American monopoly of the most advanced and powerful techniques. Defense played an increasingly important part in Powell's estimation. He called for a withdrawal of east of Suez and a concentration on Western Europe. Powell reflected that post-1945, presence of British land and air forces on the continent appeared to convey an instinctive and uncomplicated way of popular recognition that somehow Britain henceforth belongs to Western Europe. This was a striking comment made as a Labour Prime Minister submitted the UK's second application for European membership in 1967. The application was promptly rebuked by de Gaulle, but Powell was undeterred. In autumn of 1966, amid government discussions about reducing the size of the British Army of the Rhine, Powell told Sir Evelyn Shuckburgh, the new British ambassador to Italy, that the withdrawal of British forces from Germany was quite incompatible with the government's new drive to enter Europe, and merely gave the Europeans proof that we were not European-minded and were ready to seek the first opportunity to detach ourselves from the continent. With his long-standing opposition to the US alliance bolstered by the French questioning of the commitment to NATO, he argued that while the security of the British Isles is bound up with Western Europe, the North Atlantic Alliance and his balance of power analysis, an affiliation which corresponds with a less fundamental and more temporary grouping of powers. From this, Powell boldly concluded that political unity was inseparable from defensive unity, and to move towards the one is a move towards the other. In essence, you can say that this is definitely a view that was not borne out, that France leaving NATO was more of a permanent fixture, that the European Union, ultimately what it would become, what was then the EEC, and the American-led alliance were not synonymous, and that Britain could play a leading role in a more close-knit, geographically sort of cohesive bloc in Western Europe, in which they would economically, militarily, and technologically prosper. Such was his commitment essentially to this idea of forming a counterbloc to the Soviet Union and America, that he was even prepared to accept a diminution of British sovereignty in order to latch himself onto this new power grouping. So in terms of his power conception, first of all, we're talking about empire as one such power grouping vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the United States, and now he's beginning to see the European Union as another separate potential power grouping. But within this context, he views Britain potentially as more of a partner as opposed to a client, as would exist within the US alliance. Powell dramatically changed his position in 1969. He was, of course, now outside the shadow cabinet, and we should remember that Powell was far from alone in changing his views on the issue of European Community membership. For example, Tony Benn, who became one of the most prominent Labour opponents of British membership, had at one stage spoken of the possibilities of technical cooperation in the large market of the community. Nevertheless, it is clear that Powell disingenuously attempted to gloss over this earlier record of Europhilia. He said he had supported, as being right on balance at the time, the decision of Macmillan to seek membership in the European Common Market. He claimed that when Harold Wilson decided to renew that attempt 2 years ago, I was far less sure either of the wisdom or the prospects, but I did not see how Heath and the Tory party could credibly do other than wish him success. Yet Powell argued that the situation was transformed, as the likely rejection of the application became clear. Powell now saw leaving it on the table as a humiliation. Where he had previously emphasized Britain's connectedness with Europe, Powell now struck a different note, identifying objections to the community membership about both economics and sovereignty. He argued that being an island, we are a commercial nation with a maximum number of options open, and that the ideal thing for us would be freedom of trade with as many countries as possible. He thus identified the European Community's common external tariff as one of its disadvantages for the UK. In a context where Powell argued that public opinion required a clear, definite, and cast iron case be made for entry, he set out to prevent this mood from developing. Having previously welcomed the potential impact of the community entry on British agriculture, Powell now launched a scathing attack on the operation of the agricultural policy, an issue that was to assume greater significance in the years to come. He argued that it was politically driven and served to maintain relatively inefficient agriculture, fixing common internal prices so high as not only to keep the existing agricultural labour on the land, but to cause it to produce more than the consumers will buy, resulting often in large surpluses which the taxpayers have to buy up. These economic issues were echoed in the Conservative Party, but Powell was more distinctive in the emphasis he gave to concerns about sovereignty. He argued that the EEC involved a series of complex bureaucratic institutions not easy to reconcile with our very own different system of administration under parliamentary control, which was all the more worrying because the community's founding document, the Treaty of Rome, envisaged a progressive increase in the power and importance of the central bureaucracy of the market. At this stage, Powell did, however, hold out hope that the community itself would change as a result of the position of France, one of its two principal members, where de Gaulle had called for a Europe of nations, seemingly joined in some kind of free trade area. Powell was emphatic that this was the only Europe to which Britain, as long as she herself remains a nation, could belong, emphasizing the point I remained earlier that he was essentially looking to France as the only counterweight to forming a European supernation, and indeed a European supernation that simultaneously could diminish British sovereignty, yet also be a supplicant to the United States. With Powell's hopes subsequently thwarted as de Gaulle left office in 1969, he now focused on the proposal for the creation of a directly elected European Parliament, which he saw starkly revealing both the extent of the EEC's political ambition and the mistaken nature of them. Considering the English Parliament a core component of the British nation, Powell was clear that this did not mean that a politically united nation can be created or promoted by creating an elected parliament. His firm view was that an elected parliament cannot work unless and until as long as those who do the electing regard themselves as a single whole, all of whose parts will ultimately see their separate interests as subordinate to the interests of the whole. In keeping with his broader understanding of how nations emerged, he stressed, "I am not saying that no such nations of sense or identity could ever come into existence." Yet Powell was quick to assert that this meant a single electorate, where divisions could be on the basis of this meant a single electorate, not a nationality. At this point, Powell's emphatic view, as he told the Conservative Party Foreign Affairs Committee, was that a majority of British people did not see how they could become part of a political union. By the time of the 1970 general election, even amid the ongoing furor over immigration, Powell was arguing that the question of joining the common market is the most fundamental of all. Powerfully, he went on, "It is a question not merely of what sort of nation are we, but what nation are we to be?" With the European Economic Community having recently adopted a target of establishing a common currency, Powell argued that a single currency means a single government. He took the basic agreement between the Conservative and Labour manifestos on the community to signify the failure of the party system, which appeared no longer to do its work of offering a choice between policies. In this context, Powell argued that it was not surprising to hear demands for a referendum, which had gathered increasing momentum, especially in Labour circles from '68. Powell made it clear that he had substantial reservations. He asserted that it was inconsistent with the responsibility of government to Parliament and to the electorate, because if the referendum vote went ahead, the course advocated by the government, the result would be quite literally irresponsible government. Though in practical terms, Powell also argued that a referendum would be unhelpful to those who, taking a different view to himself, considered that the decision to join would depend on the terms which would not be clear in advance. Even with the party system working inadequately, Powell's preference was for close and continuous debate on the issue in Parliament. Again, talking about this fundamental friction within the conception of democracy, is it bound up in the institutions, the Crown and Parliament, or is it left over to public plebiscite? Indeed, in terms of contrasting this view against the idea of him being a populist, he is still very much vesting the conception of power and of policy as vested within Parliament and parliamentary debates, as opposed to being a article opened up to the public. And indeed, in terms of expanding on this point, he is correct in a sense in terms of representing irresponsible government. And I will use this to its counterpart, the Brexit referendum in 2016. David Cameron used the Brexit referendum in 2016 to essentially shut up the Eurosceptic backbenchers in his party by essentially confirming Britain's continued membership of the European Union, albeit under his supposed renegotiated arrangement with the with the European Union, as a fait accompli. Of course, this was disastrous. He was defeated. The government's position essentially went into complete chaos, and the Conservative Party spent the next 4 years attempting to reconcile itself with a policy that had effectively been foisted on them as a result of the incompetent bungling of David Cameron. And now it's pretty obvious that the Conservative Party never had any intention of implementing the spirit of Brexit, whatever you can call that, but this is another point. But in essence, Powell is essentially right. The idea of a referendum is contrary to the whole system of government within the United Kingdom, and a government being bound by a referendum effectively creates essentially a government paralysis or a political vacuum, as occurred between 2016 and 2019, or at least I believe that is a rather convincing view to take. Powell's attack soon turned increasingly to the Conservatives, and in particular to Heath. 12 days after victory in the 1970 general election, Heath launched a third application to join. Despite the commitment to open negotiations, the Conservative manifesto had avoided an overt commitment to entry. But Heath now took the view that his 30-seat majority was a sufficient mandate. A 30-seat majority, to anyone who's not British watching this, is tiny. In January of 1971, Geoffrey Ripon, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who had been given the job of negotiating entry, struck a preemptive blow at Powell, noting his earlier change of position in the House of Commons. Powell hit back in April, accusing the government of sleight of hand. He contended that instead of the negotiations being about the terms upon which Britain would agree to be a member of the community, they had begun with the government accepting the community and its rules and principles exactly as they stand, and were now merely about when it would happen. What was the transition period? Powell had a point, but this was dramatic language and even prompted a call from Powell to resign from the party. In a context where the government was concerned about public attitudes towards the EEC, with polls suggesting the electorate was either against or apathetic, Powell pressed his arguments further. He did so in a high-profile speech in The Hague, with the Foreign Office having worried in advance that Powell would place the British Embassy in an awkward position by contradicting the official government line as negotiations with the EEC neared conclusion. And Powell did just that. Exaggerating the clarity of public attitudes, he argued that opinion in Britain is preponderantly hostile to British membership and is steadily becoming more and more hostile, adding the objection went to the very root of the community's professed political objectives. With the conclusion of the negotiations in June of 1971 and a government white paper published the following month, Powell argued that opinion had been right to fasten upon sovereignty as the central issue because entry meant a declaration of intent to surrender this country's sovereignty stage by stage in all that matters to a nation and makes a nation. Powell argued that what he saw as public opposition to the EEC membership was part of a broader desire to get back our pride and our confidence in ourselves. Powell was now clear that concerns over the loss of sovereignty overrode economic considerations in importance. He contended that even if the economic effects of British membership were as beneficial as I believed them to be, the reverse, they would still weigh slightly on the scale against the political consequences. Even so, at a point when he was increasingly critical from a free market perspective of the direction of the Conservative government's economic policy, Powell stressed that through membership, Britain would lose the vital principle of her commercial policy, the ability to seek, through the free choice of her citizens, the pattern of external trade, which at the time accords mostly with her own best interests. Powell also extended his attack by comparing the government's handling of the European issue with immigration. He contended that as in the latter case, the public were fearful that another alteration as large and unwelcome in its effect upon Britain might similarly come without consent and without consultation. In heavily populist terms, Powell argued that the pattern has every appearance of being the same. A minority, perhaps a small minority, determines the questions over the heads of the majority, and then is presented to the majority as a fait accompli and told that it is good for them, and that anyhow it is too late to argue about it now. Returning to his argument about the electorate's inability to find the alternatives personified and dramatized by the parties on questions of most crucial and lasting importance, Powell now called this a tacit connivance between the two great parties in the state and used it to justify his increasing criticism of his own party. For the individual members of Parliament, for the individual parliament and members of Parliament, it creates a new duty and responsibility. He can no longer be just a representative in local or sectional concerns, but in anything beyond them. Claim that merely by virtue of adherence to party, he is playing his part in the political debate on behalf of the constituents who elected him. As the storm centre of politics has deserted, the dread ground between the parties, so the member's personal responsibility has been elevated to the national plane, and he finds himself called upon to perform a duty and fulfil a function as an individual, which for the time being Parliament and party have collectively abandoned. So we go from Europe and the idea of essentially the connivance against democracy and rule of a minority, lack of public consent, to finally come to his views on immigration and placing his Birmingham speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, within its full context. Here I have another article, which is Peter Brooke's India, Post-Imperialism, and the Origins of Enoch Powell's Rivers and Blood speech. In 1946, Powell drew up a detailed plan for India's future within the empire for the benefit of the Conservative Research Department. Recently open to the public, they shed critical light on his opposition to immigration, Powell's. In December of 1946, Powell submitted his most developed analysis of India's problems and future as an imperial possession. The report was largely economic in subject. In a paragraph ignored by Simon Heffer, Powell commented on international trade and the flow of labor. That division of labor and specialization of production should be bounded by national frontiers is to some extent inevitable because men have differences other than economic ones, such as political and racial, and value certain other aims more highly than economic aims. Compared with nations as closely connected politically and racially as the British dominions, Powell believed these differences to be greater between Europe and Asiatic nations. Applied to the case of India, it is clear that no economic policy can be adopted for India, which by treating it as an integral part of a larger area would tend towards redistribution of population between it and other nations, especially European nations. Thus, in 1946, with red-blooded imperialism running untempered in his veins, it should be noted that Peter Brooke is no fan of Powell, but I'll overlook such adjectives being thrown his way. I think what I appreciate very much about the Corthorn book is for something written so recently and so comprehensively and with the amount of academic citations, it is remarkably objective, which is why I appreciate it so much. Powell was deeply unhappy about the ideas of Indians migrating to Britain. In other words, Powell had been cognizant of this fact for a good 20 years, which again should inform our understanding that Powell was effectively a cynical and populist politician who would flip his policy on a whim. I don't believe that's consistent. Even when looking at his stance on the European Union, he's having to juggle these very complex arguments regarding free trade economics, British sovereignty, immigration, and the realities of great power politics. The obstacles to redistribution of labor between India and Britain proved to be the focus of Powell's political plans for India. Having established that immigration was problematic because of men's political and racial differences, he proceeded to explain in detail the nature of those differences. Powell's goal was the granting of self-government to an imperial India. Since the self-governing concept was essentially the Westminster model of parliamentary government, Powell was effectively asking himself what would need to be done to make Indians behave like the British. This exercise started from the premise that Indians were not yet sufficiently British for self-government to work. In explaining why this was, Powell revealed exactly why he thought Indian immigration would be problematic. Writing in Delhi in November of 1945, Powell considered the difficulties of granting self-government. Like many 19th century liberal theorists of colonial administrators they influenced, Powell concluded that the essence of the problem lies in rigid and inelastic nature of communal vote and the absence of a public opinion directed to political issues properly so called. What India lacked was a spontaneous, genuine, and reasonably informed public opinion and national sentiment. In other words, you can say that this is consistent with this idea that India had not yet become a nation in which democracy would necessarily be conducive. And again, going back to this idea of Powell believing that there is no such thing as a society in general, there is a thing of society in particular, and that political realities and expectations should conform to the particular and not be imposed by some abstract universalism. His characteristic Tory concern was for the political homogeneity of the nation, expressed as a collective sentiment of belonging, And I don't necessarily agree with this idea of homogeneity, which has been put forward by the writer here, but necessarily it's this idea of the nation coming into being, as indeed with a European government as an extension of a European parliament, that there has to be a psychic reality, not necessarily a call to absolute homogeneity. This was in turn a prerequisite for democracy, or self-government, a concept central to Powell's thought in general. Powell believed that Indians did not think as a nation, but as groups, which is why their political parties were communal. To reference this, of course, India is not only very diverse religiously, it is also very diverse racially. Dravidians in the south, Aryans in the north, within religious groups, Sikh, Jains, Hindus, and Muslims. Muslims in particular, of course, gaining greater political power under the Muslim League led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and what ultimately lead to the formation of Pakistan. So this was not a flighting fancy by Powell that such a thing did not exist. It was proven, it was actionable by events that occurred. Powell thought this also meant the Indians did not think as rational individuals. Again, I'm not necessarily sure I believe that. Not rational individuals in terms of being able to understand and replicate British norms, perhaps, but I'll have to qualify that at some point, especially given his other statements on India regarding his appreciation of Indian culture. And were he to apply the word racialism, he would put India on a pedestal, essentially compared to even that of Britain. Democracy could not operate in India. Using the example of voting for independence, Powell explained that the issue involved and the factors upon which they can be rationally be decided alike are inaccessible to their experience and their reason. So in terms, again, of thinking rationally, the idea that Powell, I believe, is really positing is that the Indian National Congress is not a democratic representative party in a way that perhaps can be understood in the West. Rather, it represents a Western educated, Western aligned elite who is essentially trying to bring about a democratic Indian independent state or reality by a top down mandate, and is essentially presenting itself to Britain de facto as the independence faction. Hence, why the advent of democracy in India may be complicated and turbulent. In 1946, Powell developed his plans for the creation of a truly national community in India, composed of rational individuals. In an undated note from early 1946, he proved the means to this end. It is only by bringing social and economic motives into the lives of Indian masses, into the existing religious and racial factions, can eventually be replaced by true political parties without which democracy and therefore self-government within the empire is impossible. Powell added greater detail to this in his reports to December of 1946. He stated that to create conditions in which self-government of United India will become possible is the very object in its political aspect for the plan for rapid economic and social advance which has been put forward. Rapid economic development would in itself contribute substantially towards the democratic by rendering the effects of alternative policies a matter of direct and obvious concern to a larger and larger proportion of the electorate. It would also provide the economic basis for that spread of literacy and education with which the political vote cannot be exercised rationally. Without such a program, the fact that the so-called Indian political parties are, with unimportant exceptions, fixed and unchanging communal bodies would render any system of self-government unworkable. Thus, the idea of Indian migration to Britain affected Powell because he believed that communalism threatened the future of a self-governing nation, whether India or Britain. His experience of the Raj had convinced him that the root of India's political troubles effectively lay in communalism, which he later described as the curse of India. Since its antidote was the fostering of economic freedom for the individual, Powell also believed that economic freedom could also be cultivated as a form of nationalism, in particular anti-socialist nationalism. Powell's plans for India suggest the origins of his career, long fascination with the free market. He always claimed that Powellism was a coherent whole. That fear of communalism should have initiated Powell's interest in the free market may explain his comment to a friend in March of 1968 that it had not occurred to me that you or anyone could think that opposition to immigration was inconsistent with general liberal economic thought as set out in A Nation Not Afraid. And this is in stark contrast to many libertarian arguments that believe that immigration is essentially conducive with liberal economics. And as for Powell, in terms of trying to understand this, economics as inextricably linked to nationalism and economic systems as not being universal but as being particular. In that sense, if Britain was essentially a liberal country, then economic conditions in Britain could be conducive to a free trade standard for economics and the idea of expanding commercialism and trade, and the fact that that situation did not exist on the ground in India in 1946. In 1946, Powell's dream was to create the conditions necessary to export self-government from Britain to the Empire, merely national unity of sentiment. His nightmare was that self-government might be granted to colonies before that unity had been fostered. Even more, Powell feared that the Empire might inject communalism into the self-governing metropole, i.e. the United Kingdom, and thereby undermine its existing sentimental unity. And if either situation were to arise, he predicted that democratic political liberty would be strangled. Powell believed that his fears were realized in India in 1947 and in Britain itself in the 1960s. In 1947, he was fully aware of the communal violence that was attendant on the granting of Indian independence. Powell had two regular correspondents alerting him to the situation in India at the same time, namely Gordon Thompson, commander in the Calcutta area, and Frank Socrates Brain. While Thompson mostly sent his own opinions, Brain sent Powell confidential government reports on the situation in the Punjab. It was evident from the reports that the British government's promise of imminent independence and democracy had prompted instead mass violence. One observer provided a lengthy catalogue of atrocities that concluded, "All this happened when His Majesty's government was busy transferring power to Indian hands. The administrative machinery broke down completely. People died like flies, but nobody took any notice of them. Whitehall forgot to carry out its pledges to the minorities and to the dumb and driven millions. On the 15th of August came freedom, the freedom to burn, loot, and murder." Although Powell was undoubtedly much shaken by the loss of India and its attendant conflagration, he cannot have been surprised by the events. Over a year before, he had predicted the effect of granting self-government to an artificial nation riven by communalism. An outbreak of violence in India, such as will dwarf 1857, that being the Sepoy Rebellion or the Great Indian Mutiny, is not only likely, but near certain. It can only be assumed. Sorry, chat is being very distracting, unfortunately. During the early 1950s, Powell translated the lessons that he had learned in India into policy for both the Empire and Britain. He believed that democracy could not be introduced or maintained if an electorate suffered from rigid divisions. An observation prompted by post-war colonial political development. The point was made most forcefully in 1955. In his words, no elective assembly can survive and function unless its constituency, to use the word in the old sense of the population, represented a sufficient homogeneity. This he had learnt from India in 1947. The population of India declared itself emphatically not to be a constituency and sealed the declaration with civil bloodshed. Powell elaborated, "The principle of majority decision is divisive. It splits a society along the natural lines of fission into the sections sufficiently homogeneous for all their members to accept the will of the majority of their own. The line of fission may be linguistic, or again the line of fission may be racial, provided the difference of race in the absence of religious or linguistic differences is marked by the plain and visible distances such as colour, for men assume for those who look differently and from themselves have different interests. There could scarcely be an anti-Jewishness, as we have known unless the Jews were recognizable at sight." Applying the principle in Britain, Powell repeated a point made in a speech at Hanover in December of 1953, arguing that there is no such thing as an Anglo-Irish electorate. In the mid-1950s, Powell also applied his thoughts on national homogeneity to the new issue of colonial immigration to Britain. In 1954, he commented that the differences between colonial peoples and the British precluded a unified imperial democracy because it implied, greater homogeneity in the electorate than can subsist between a European and a non-European territory. Then, in February of 1955, he registered his private opposition to immigration from the colonies to Britain, giving a detailed justification. Finally, in 1956, he touched on the issue in public. An analysis of these responses to the beginnings of mass migration, in particular that of 1955, reveals a consistency with his hypothetical response in 1946. The occasion for Powell's concern in 1955 was a strike of bus workers in West Bromwich in protest against the employment of a single Indian conductor. The bishops of Birmingham and Lichfield had been appalled and spoken out, believing that efforts to enforce a colour bar are not reconcilable with Christianity. Powell wrote to the bishop, "It appears to me that there are two issues involved. The immediate question is the employment by the corporation of a single subject of Indian origin, but it's impossible to separate that narrow issue with the wider one of the influx of British subjects, not of European race, into the United Kingdom during recent months. I feel that it is only because of this background that the employment of individual non-European by West Bromwich had assumed such importance in the eyes of those on strike. It appears to me that in a democratic country, by which I mean a country where counting heads has practical importance, any readily visible differences between human beings inevitably result in political frictions. Where such differences are very slight, or where the sector of population so distinguishable is very small, no harm results. But where a considerable parts of a population has distinctive characteristics, I believe that the working of the institutions such as ours cannot fail to be endangered. However wrongly headed and gropingly, I believe the strikers in West Bromwich to have apprehended a danger for this country of an appreciable coloured population becoming docile here." Powell's rejection of the colonial empire in 1954 was the context of these concerns in 1955, but also it contributed to his conviction. It was not the cause, since he had been an identical concern for national homogeneity in relation to the situation in India. Powell did not make his political theory conditional upon the ending of the empire. In fact, his ideas on the nature of nation and democracy had been establishing while imagining the future of the empire, not its end. In writing to a bishop in 1955, Powell was expressing a principle that had been born in the mind of his previous imperialism. Between 55 and 68, Powell showed a sporadic and growing interest in imperial migration. I think what the author is trying to do is link in the minds that essentially this was a layabout of imperialism, and I don't believe that is actually borne out by the arguments that I presented here. Rather, Powell believes that Britain essentially has persisted as a homogenous and, to use his words, a institution enjoying a particular society, which by extension would lead to a ancient 1,000-year-old liberty and a manifestation of 19th century political thought, which will contribute to the idea of crown in parliament and democracy, that he had attempted to find a situation to reconcile the idea of empire within the broader scope of nationalism, and that nationalism essentially, and focusing on Britain in the particular and the empire, was a reflection of the realities on the ground to the passivity and pusillanimous nature of the conservative elites, as previously stated. The fact that now the empire's decline is effectively a fait accompli, there is very little that can be done about it, even before the situation in Suez. So when coming here to the situation, rather, it is not necessarily Powell's ardent imperialism, as the author that's making it out will justify his anti-immigration views. It is something consistent sans imperialism. Rather, his experience in imperial administration essentially does more effectively to, in his mind, vindicate the idea that the empire is a doomed project, and that such conditions which had doomed the empire cannot be invented in Britain, imported and replicated. So, if anything, the empire and his anti-immigration views almost seem to be in sharp contradistinction, and his situation in India confirming his anti-communalism. Between 1955 and 1968, or at least that's my view, Powell showed a sporadic and growing interest in immigration. However, it wasn't until 1968 that he publicly explained his antipathy towards it, revealing a striking continuity with these previously held ideas. Powell expressed reservations to the Cabinet Subcommittee dealing with immigration control to the local press in 1956. In 1960, Powell again took up the issue, lobbying in November to join the Commonwealth Migrants Committee, chaired by Lord Killimer. It was this committee that drew up the Commonwealth Immigration Bill that became law in 1962. Between 1960 and 63, as a health minister, he was involved in the recruitment of doctors and nurses from overseas, despite later accusation of hypocrisy. Powell argued that the recruits are not immigrants. They are here for 1 or 2 years as part of their training and experience. And this is a fundamental aspect in terms of understanding Powell's thought. Immigration is essentially contingent on re-immigration, that there is no such thing, according to Powell's mind, as accepting the idea of permanent immigration, but rather when faced with a manpower shortage or crisis, when he was dealing with the NHS as Minister of Health between 1960 and 63, he was more than prepared to accept immigrant support and influx of workers into the NHS, but not with the understanding that they would therefore become permanent citizens. Indeed, the transition within Powell's thought of subject becoming citizen and that becoming deracinated from fealty to Britain and the constitution of that land represented by the Crown and Parliament. In April and June of 1964, Powell made his first comments in the press since 1956, following Peter Griffith's successful exploitation of immigration in a by-election. Powell also highlighted the issue in the election of 1964. The essence of his policy was a tightening of Commonwealth immigration, with the aim of fostering integration of those immigrants already resident in the UK. To this, he added in 1965 the proposals that the government should assist voluntary repatriation of immigrants. His ideas were concurrent with the developing policies of his party leader, then Alec Douglas Home. Powell mentioned immigration in a speech just before the election of March 1966, then made a periodic public reference to the issue throughout 1967, dropping all mention of integration as a goal. Powell seemed to have come to the conclusion by 1967 that immigrant colonies in certain areas and cities were now a permanent feature of the British demographic landscape. Before 1968, Powell's approach to the problem of immigration was subject to some change. However, in 1968, it underwent a revolution that marked a distinct departure. And this is finally where I actually come, and I am going to read the entirety of the speech. And the reason I'm going to read the entirety is not that long, is simply for the sake of providing full context. Hopefully with that article, I've outlined the intellectual development and the political development of Powell in order to justify getting to this point, and I will add a quick epilogue after the immigration section in order to provide further context. But I recall back, I think Lady of Shalott might even remember this, she's in the chat, back in 2018, it was the 50th anniversary of the Rivers of Blood speech. And there was a huge controversy about whether to even air this speech, whether it was so provocative, it was so evil. And that is essentially Powell's legacy as far as sort of mainstream political thought in Britain can attest. There are aspects of the Conservative Party, I believe as early as the 2000s, which tended to focus on the reconcilable aspects of Powellism, which is him as some sort of a pre-Thatcherite. But regarding the foreign policy, which I find most fascinating about Powell, his conceptions and evolving nature of the empire, his views on the European Union, and his views on immigration, all these aspects of the bottom. So here we are, the Birmingham speech from 1968. The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. In seeking to do so, it encounters obstacles which are deeply rooted in human nature. One is that by very order of things, such evils are not demonstrable until they have occurred. At each stage in their onset, there is room for doubt and for dispute whether they be real or imaginary. By the same token, they attract little attention in comparison with current troubles, which are both indisputable and pressing, whence the besetting temptation of all politics to concern itself with the immediate present and the expense of the future. So this particular segment, again, the consistent theme about Powell's thought, he's not a reactionary simply in the note that he's wanting to return to some previous idealist past. He's always thinking about continuity in terms of the inheritance of the British nation and being able to provide an aspect of that into the future. He is thinking in generational terms. He's thinking 10, 20, 100 years. His political thought is very much anchored in the more, say, for example, Tory constitutionalists, A.V. Dicey, etc., in the 19th century. And he has a historic understanding, not only of Britain, but you can say this is also rooted in his appreciation and his previous work as a professor in classics. And you can say that this is endemic and a often criticized aspect of all democratic systems: short-termism, electoral politics, the fact that, say, for example, Putin's Russia, Putin is able to conceive of politics in the long term in ways that many democratic politicians cannot, at least those representing an executive body, such as the president of the United States, operating within specific term limits. This, of course, doesn't apply to, say, for example, other permanent aspects of the political system which operate under any managerial regime. So back to Powell. Above all, people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles and even desiring troubles. If only they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. Perhaps this habit goes back to the primitive belief that the word and the thing, the name and the object are identical. At all events, the discussion of future grave, but with effort now avoidable evils, is the most unpopular and at the same time the most necessary occupation for the politician. Those who knowingly shirk it deserve and not frequently receive the curses of those who come after. A week or two ago, I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalized industries. Now, the usage of first-hand accounts is something that critics of Powell have come out and said that these people don't exist, that Powell has simply invented them. Again, in terms of my own appreciation of certain contradictions in logic, simultaneously, these people do exist and they represent a clear and present danger. And yet at the same time, they do not exist. And such arguments need to be invented and whipped up without any due consideration. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, "If I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this country." I made some deprecatory reply to the effect that even this government wouldn't last forever, but he took no notice and continued, "I have 3 children. All of them have been through grammar school, and 2 of them are married now, with family. I shan't be satisfied till I've seen them all settled overseas. In this country, in 15 or 20 years, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." And it's for that particular quote that they believe that Powell invented this interaction. I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings of repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right to do so. Here is a decent ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his member of parliament, that his country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking, not throughout Great Britain, perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history. This also bears in mind something more fundamental. Again, Powell considering this his obligation as a national representative. In terms of some sort of democratic consensus, Powell is thinking locally, i.e. to his own constituents in Wolverhampton. But he's also projecting this idea in terms of the constituents and constituents as representing a microcosm of Great Britain itself. So there is a particular local concern identified in the one constituent, and that is projected to a general national malaise or a feeling of unease. In Powell's utilization of this commentary, and Powell attempting to use this to warn or to prophesize, to come back to the analogy of the Cumean Sibyl, you can say again that this is a manifestation of Powell's very particular conception of British democratic representation. In 15 or 20 years on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. That is not my figure. That is the official figure given to Parliament by the spokesman of the Registrar General Office. There is no comparable official figure for the year 2000, but it must be in the region to 5 to 7 million, approximately 1/10 of the whole population, and approaching that of Greater London. And I believe in the grand scheme of things, looking back on this, he underestimated. Of course, it will not be evenly distributed from Margate to Aberystwyth, from Penzance to Aberdeen. Whole areas, towns, parts, and towns across England will be occupied by sections of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population. As time goes on, the proportion of this total who are immigrant descendants, those born in England, who arrived here by exactly the same route as the rest of us, will rapidly increase. Already by 1985, the native-born constitute the majority. It is this fact which creates the extreme urgency of action now, of just what kind of action, which is hardest for politicians to take. Action where the difficulties lie in the presence, but the evils to be prevented or minimized lie several parliaments ahead. The natural and rational first question with a nation confronted by such a prospect is to ask, how can its dimensions be reduced? Granted, it is not wholly preventable. Can it be limited, bearing in mind that numbers are of the essence, the significance and consequence of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%? The answer to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational, by stopping or virtually stopping further inflow and by promoting the maximum outflow. Both answers are part of the official policy of the Conservative Party. It almost passes belief that at this moment 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week, which means that 15 or 20 additional families a decade or two hence. Those whom the goals wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad, literally mad as a nation, be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So insane are we that we are actually permitting unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding a family with spouses and fiancés who they have never seen. Let no one suppose that the flow of dependents will automatically tail off. On the contrary, even at the present admission rate of only 5,000 a year, there is sufficient for a further 25,000 dependents per annum, ad infinitum, without taking into account the huge reservoir of existing relations in this country. And I am making no allowance at all for fraudulent entry. In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but the total inflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that necessary legislative and administrative measures be taken without delay. I stress the word for settlement. This has nothing to do with the entry of Commonwealth citizens any more than for aliens into this country for the purposes of study or of improving their qualifications, like, for instance, Commonwealth doctors who take the advantage of their own countries have enabled our hospital service to be expanded faster than would otherwise been possible. They are not, never have been immigrants, echoing his policies, of course, when he was health minister between 1960 and 1963. Indeed, in contrast to Powell's opposition to the post-war consensus economic model, you can say that his veneration and protection of the National Health Service isn't something simply related to his political repertoire, that being one of the only sort of major ministries he ever occupied in government. But I think he considers this an extension of, you can say, national pride and a desire to show due compassion and consideration for the national population. You could say that that would actually be consistent with a lot of the sort of groundswell of momentum to create the National Health Service in the aftermath of the Second World War. Whether his arguments necessarily are true, I don't think is enough for the remit of this examination, I'm afraid. We're already going probably for about 3.5 hours. I turn to re-immigration. If all immigration ended tomorrow, the rate of growth of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population would be substantially reduced, but the prospective size of this element in the population would still leave the basic character of the national danger unaffected. This can only be tackled while a considerable proportion of the total still comprises persons who entered this country during the last 10 years or so. Hence the urgency of implementing now the second element of the Conservative Party's policy, the encouragement of re-immigration. Nobody can make an estimate of the numbers which, with generous assistance, would choose either to return to their countries of origin or to go to other countries, anxious to receive the manpower and the skills they represent. Nobody knows because no such policy has yet been attempted. I can only say that even at present, immigrants from my own constituency from time to time come to me, asking if I can find them assistance to return home. If such a policy were adopted and pursued with determination with the gravity of the alternative justifies, the resultant outflow could appreciably alter the prospects. The third element of the Conservative Party's policy is that all who are in this country as citizens should be equal before the law, and that there should be no discrimination or difference made between them and the public authority. As Mr. Heath, then party leader, had put it, we will have no first-class citizens and no second-class citizens. Again, use of the word citizen made by Heath. This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendants should be elevated into a privileged or special class, or that the citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in the management of his own affairs between one citizen and another, or that he should be subjected to imposition as to his reasons and motive for behaving in one lawful manner rather than another. There could be no greater misconception of the realities than is entertained by those who vociferously demand legislation, as they call it, against discrimination, whether they be leader writers of the same kidney and sometimes on the same newspapers which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it, or archbishops who live in palaces, faring delicately with the bedcloths pulled right over their heads. They have got it exactly and diametrically wrong. The discrimination and deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment, lies not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of this kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder. The kindest thing that could be said about those who propose and support it is that they know not what they do. Nothing is more misleading than comparison between the Commonwealth immigrant in Britain and the American black. The black population of the United States, which was already in existence before the United Nations became a nation, started literally as slaves and were later given the franchise and other rights of citizenship, to the exercise of which they have only gradually and still incompletely come. The Commonwealth immigrant came to Britain as a full citizen, to a country which knew no discrimination between one citizen and another, and he entered instantly into a possession of the rights of every citizen, from the right to vote to free treatment under the National Health Service. This also explains part of the context in which Powell was making this speech. Powell is not just concerned with the foreign policy implications of Americanism, but he's also concerned with American internal politics. And that is with specific reference to the race riots in 1968 and general you can almost say the revolutions of 1968, not just in America, but across Europe. As communalism in India affected his view in 1946, the fraught ethnic situation in America in 1968 is also very much coloring his view. Whatever drawbacks attended the immigrant arose not from the law or from public policy or from administration, but from those personal circumstances and accidents which cause and will always cause the fortunes and experience of one man to be different from another. But while to the immigrant entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different, for reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default, upon which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds and childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighborhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found their employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went on by, more and more voices which told them that they were now unwanted. They now learn that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament, a law which cannot and is not intended to operate to protect them or address their grievances, is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. In the hundreds upon hundreds of letters I received when I last spoke on this subject 2 or 3 months ago, there was one striking feature which was largely new and which I find ominous. All members of Parliament are used to the typical anonymous correspondent. But what surprised and alarmed me was the high proportion of ordinary, decent, sensible people writing a rational and often well-educated letter who believed that they had to omit their address because it was dangerous to have committed themselves to a paper to a member of Parliament agreeing with the views I had expressed, and that they would risk penalties or reprisals if they were known to have done so. The sense of being a persecuted minority, which is growing among ordinary English people in the areas of the country which are affected, is something that those without direct experience can hardly imagine. I am going to allow just one of those 100 people to speak for me. 8 years ago, in a respectable street in Wolverhampton, a house was sold to a Negro. Now only one white, a woman old age pensioner, lives there. This was her story. She lost her husband and both her sons in the war. She turned her 7-roomed house, her only asset, into a boarding house. She worked hard and did well, paid off her mortgage, and began to put something by her for old age. Then the immigrants moved in. With growing fear, she saw one house after another taken over. The quiet street became a place of noise and confusion. Regretfully, her white tenants moved out. The day after the last one, she was awakened at 7 a.m. by 2 Negroes who wanted to use her phone to contact their employer. When she refused, and she would have refused any stranger at such an hour, she was abused and feared she would have been attacked but for the chain on her door. Immigrant families have tried to rent rooms in her house, but she always refused. Her little store of money went, and after paying rates, she had less than £2 a week. She went to apply for a rate reduction and was seen by a young girl who, on hearing she had a 7-roomed house, suggested she let part of it. When she said the only people who could get were Negroes, the girl said, "Racial prejudice won't get you anywhere in this country." She went home. The telephone is her lifeline. Her family pay the bill and help her out as best they can. Immigrants had offered to buy her house at a price which the prospective landlord would be able to recover from his tenants in weeks, at the most a few months. She is becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shops, she is followed by children, charming, wide-grinned piccaninnies. They cannot speak English, but one word they do know, racialist, they chant. When the new race relations bill is passed, this woman is convinced she will go to prison. And is she so wrong? I begin to wonder. The other dangerous delusions from which those who are willfully or otherwise blind to reality suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times when there are marked physical differences, especially of colour, integration is difficult, though over a period not impossible. There are among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the past 50 years or so, many thousands who wish and propose to be integrated, and whose every thought and endeavour is bent in that direction. But to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception and a dangerous one. We are on the verge here of change. Hitherto it has been a force of circumstance and of background, which has rendered the very idea of integration inaccessible to the greater part of the immigrant population, that they were never conceived or intended such a thing, and that their numbers and physical concentration meant the pressures towards integration, which normally bear upon the small minority, did not operate. Now we are seeing the growth of positive forces acting against integration, of vested interest in the preservation and sharpening of racial and religious differences, with a view to exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants and then over the rest of the population. The cloud no bigger than a man's hand that can so rapidly overcast the sky has been visibly recently in Wolverhampton and has shown signs of spreading quickly. The words I am about to use, verbatim, as they appeared in the local press on the 17th of February, are not mine, but those of a Labour Member of Parliament who is a minister in this present government. The Sikh community's campaign to maintain customs inappropriate in Britain is much to be regretted. Working in Britain, particularly in the public services, they should be prepared to accept the terms and conditions of their employment. To claim special communal rights, or what should say rights, leads to a dangerous fragmentation within society. This communalism is a canker. Whether practiced by one colour or another, it is to be strongly condemned. All credit to John Stonehouse for having had the insight to perceive that and courage to say it. For these dangerous and divisive elements, the legislation proposed in the Race Relations Bill is the very pabulum they need to flourish. Here is the means of showing that the immigrant communities can organize to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest with the legal weapons which the ignorant and the ill-informed have provided. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, of course referring to the race riots, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the states itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the century. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal. So that is the full speech. And I think just reading it, I think again, it's just interesting to view this as part of a consistent thought in terms of what I've been trying to outline in this conversation, which is that fundamentally of Powellism. But rather than representing some form of chrysalis or call to action, as perhaps he would have wanted, by appealing to the long-term implications of a policy which was quoted by Powell as being literally mad, it instead represented Powell's ostracization from the mainstream of British politics, him becoming a perpetual outsider within the Conservative Party and really within the entire British establishment. And this, in terms of the aftermath, is going back to Corthorn. Sorry, I'm just getting a comment in the chat. Because this isn't something I probably have a chance to mention. Lou Bonds, was Powell an Anglican? He was an Anglican. He began his life as an atheist. I would actually perhaps consider that in view of his particularism, I would see him more as a perennialist. And his Anglicanism, I think, can be understood within the context of perennialism, i.e., Anglican Reformed Christianity is the religion of Great Britain, if that makes sense. As for his role of Christianity in politics, this is something he would bring up. He declared that he was essentially a British nationalist first and a Christian second. And this was the argumentation he would use in opposition to, even as stated in the Birmingham speech regarding his opposition to the clergy, an opposition which dated back to his comments made over a decade earlier. When it comes to the race blindness of various priests within the Anglican community, focusing on essentially the Christian human as opposed to the existence of nations, the Christian subject as opposed to the existence of nations. And indeed, nothing's changed in that regard. If you look to Justin Welby and you look to the advocacy of the Lord spiritual, rather than sort of veer away from this course, their calls in terms of pro-migration, in terms of being able to understand and accept the presence essentially of infinity refugees, is effectively stated political policy of the upper echelons of the Anglican Church. Nothing's changed there. And that is where Powell's personal Anglicanism comes into conflict with his political realization, so to speak. Hopefully that's a brief but a sufficient view as to where his Anglicanism enters into this view. So going back to Corthorn. A Gallup opinion poll taken days after the Birmingham speech found that 96% of people had heard or read about it. Its immediate effect was to set in motion parallel debates about racialism and opportunism, which, linked to Powell's lack of constructive proposals, saw him consistently on the defensive for the next 2 years. With the support of key members of the LCC, including Hogg and MacLeod, the Shadow Chancellor, Heath promptly dismissed Powell from his post of Shadow Defence Minister because his speech had been racialist in tone and liable to exacerbate racial tensions. Powell responded that Heath must have known it was nothing of the kind, and went on to accuse Heath of playing down an even unsaying policy, unsaying policies and views which you hold and believe to be right for fear of clamour from some sector of the press or public. A little later, Powell spelled out his position in the Birmingham Post. What I would take racialist to mean is a person who believes in the inherent superiority of one race or mankind to another, and who acts and speaks in that belief. So the answer to the question of whether I'm a racialist is no. Yet the charge was widespread. The Times called the speech racialist, calculated to inflame hatred between the races, prompting Powell to withdraw from a lunch with its senior editorial staff that had been arranged the previous month. The Times also reported the comparison made by the former Conservative MP Humphrey Berkeley between the ethnic prejudice of Powell and anti-Semitism of the one-time leader of the British Union of Fascists, Sir Oswald Mosley, a suggestion for which Berkeley later apologized after writing a favorable biography of Powell. At the same time, there was also substantial public as well as political support for Powell, with some of it explicitly rejecting charges of racialism. Only two national newspapers supported Powell, the Daily Express and the News of the World, but they had a combined circulation of over 10 million. Famously, a group of immigration officers at Heathrow Airport, as private individuals, heartily endorsed Powell's position. Between 800 and 2,300 dockers, depending on estimates, marched to Parliament to demonstrate their support for Powell. A Gallup poll in early May found that 74% of those questioned agreed with the speech, with 15% disagreeing and 11% giving no opinion. Within a fortnight, Powell had received about 100,000 letters from members of the public, of which only 800 were critical of him. Powell allowed Diana Spearman, who had worked at the Conservative Research Department, to look at these letters, and she went on to make an important intervention in the debate. Selecting a sample of 3,537, she argued that only 71 of them were racialist. Yet Spearman had adopted a very narrow definition of the term. This covered general accusations against the immigrants, the use of the words generally considered offensive to them. I'm not going to use them for obvious reasons, and even then added the qualification unless they occur in letters with a specific complaint is made. Douglas Home argued that Powell's language may have been ill-chosen and extravagant, but he is not and never has been a racialist. Gilbert Longden, a Conservative MP who have collaborated with Powell in the One Nation group, issued a statement in support of him, saying that his fears for the future of this country of the immigration of the other races is allowed to continue are fully justified. The Monday Club, whose membership was growing rapidly at this point, expressed overall support for Powell on immigration. The government itself had swiftly decided that Powell would not be prosecuted for incitement to racial hatred under the terms of the 1965 Race Relations Act, not least because intention was so difficult to prove, but the manner in which he merely offered a bold announcement of the decision without going into detail indicated an awareness of the need to tread carefully among a heated debate. Indeed, had the government decided to prosecute Enoch Powell in accordance with the 1965 Race Relations Act, which was brought in during the Harold Wilson government, I think it would have gone much further to actually vindicate the sentiment and the specific examples which were brought up in the Rivers of Blood speech. So I think it was a very politic decision not to essentially justify Powell. But more than that, I think the effect of the Labour government going after Powell for the speech would have been tantamount essentially to making him a political martyr. So interesting, wise policy, but I do have another segment regarding the implications of this legislative effects of the implications of the quote stirring up racial hatred. But as we're nearly going for 3 hours, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to bring it up. And this, of course, he's dismissed from the shadow cabinet after the speech, and now we're seeing Powell break from the Conservative Party entirely, where at one point he had, in 1975, been a contender for leader of the Conservative Party. And rather interestingly, he loses to Ted Heath, probably one of the most miserable leaders of the Conservative parties and useless prime ministers that there ever was. Powell's break with the Conservatives came in 1974, when concerned with economics and above all with Europe, i.e. joining the European Economic Community. But immigration nevertheless continued to be a prominent issue. From this point on, however, Powell was battling a perception that he moved now on the extremes of British politics. In the first place, there were suggestions that Powell's connections with the National Front had been established in 1967. But this, I'm going to focus now on his relationship with Margaret Thatcher. Academic Agent, as far as I'm aware, has well, not I'm aware, had an interesting video on his channel discussing Margaret Thatcher and the Americanization of Great Britain that occurred under her. He regularly puts up his streams and then puts them behind a paywall for channel members. But for those who are probably watching this live or watching this a couple of days before, there is a chance that you may still be able to see that video. But regarding this Americanization, of course, I believe that is one of the fundamental dividing points between Powell and Thatcher, his recognition of the perils of Atlanticism and her embrace of it. Powell's attitude to Thatcher as leader of the opposition from 1975 served to cement the sense of a separatism from mainstream of politics. Thatcher had early taken a benevolent line on Powell. The two of them had first met in 1948, but despite her long-standing admiration for Powell, which grew as she was drawn to economic arguments, Thatcher voted for Heath in 1965. Powell and Thatcher had spent 6 months in the shadow cabinet together until Powell's dismissal. In 1970, in response to criticism of her local Finchley Conservative Association choice of Powell as guest speaker, Thatcher argued that those who use this country's great tradition of freedom of speech should not seek to deny that same freedom to others. Nonetheless, Thatcher at the helm, Powell continued to attack the Conservative Party's silence or calculated evasion over the issue of immigration. Thatcher privately sought to reassure Powell that the Conservative Party believes that the present level of immigration is too high and must immediately be reduced. And in January of 1978, she famously told Grenada's television World in Action that the British people feared they might rather be swamped by people with a different culture. Thatcher's remarks were widely considered to have pandered to popular prejudices, yet in reality the position was more complex. In addition to using concerns about immigration to gain political advantage, the party had also begun from 1976 to make concerted efforts to secure the support of Black and Asian minority voters. This is why, as Powell himself noted, the party sought to minimize the impact of Thatcher's comments by stressing that she was simply echoing established party policy. Nevertheless, Thatcher's speech prompted calls for Powell to offer her support, for example, Patrick Donner, the former Conservative MP. Powell's sharp reply echoed his dismissive attitude toward her on economic policy. I am naturally watching what is happening with sardonic interest, but Mrs. Thatcher has evidently a long way to go before she even understands the matter, let alone is in a position to give any real lead on it. In any case, no measure of less of heroic dimensions can now produce any impression on the future problem. Powell was soon equally critical in public, saying that it was the cruelest folly or deception to induce people to imagine that immigration could be stopped with anything other than a policy of re-immigration and resettlement. With the Conservatives in government, and against the backdrop of urban disturbances in 1980, 81, and 85, dubbed the race riots, at the time, Powell remained as apocalyptic as ever, but in the main, his arguments did not resonate. It's now, I think, in terms of rounding out this conversation, I want to discuss something which you can't really ignore because this discusses a final aspect of Powell. We've gone from empire to misconceptions around the European Union to the defense of a British homogeneity, nation state, and now the imperiled constitution of new nationalisms arriving, not just beyond in terms of the immigration communities, which Powell is talking about, but in terms of the road to devolution, the rise of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish nationalism, and Powell's essentially decision to leave the Conservative Party and become a Ulster Unionist in terms of the last stage of his support of the British nation state, British institutions, and British nationalism against the forces of the the nationalisms of the periphery. And I don't mean that to decry Scots, Welsh, or Northern Ireland. I'm talking simply geographically in terms of the extreme north and west, but I'm also talking in terms of population, with English representing the vast majority of the overall population of the United Kingdom. As nationalist parties gained momentum in Scotland and Wales in the late 1960s, and as the discussion of some kind of devolution there intensified, Powell was adamant that Northern Irish self-government could not serve as an example of a form of semi-autonomous halfway house it was possible to construct within the United Kingdom. Powell's overall concern was to dismiss devolution as a compromise solution on the basis that nationalism, if it is real, cannot be bought off with less than complete article, ignoring the fact that Ulster Unionists has since embraced devolved power. Powell rightly emphasized that it only emerged by a sidewind during the tangled process of the creation of the Irish Free State. This being the creation of the Irish Free State in 1921 or 1922, which created first a devolved Ireland within the Commonwealth, but was ultimately superseded by Imon de Valera, Fianna Fáil, and the de facto creation of an Irish Republic, which was confirmed by Ireland's neutrality during the Second World War. Powell's argument here was a rebuke of the thinking of, among others, the pro-devolution Scottish Labour politician and politics academic John P. Mackintosh, who sought to bring Northern Ireland into the debate, and Labour thinking from the governments of the second government of Harold Wilson, the government of James Callaghan, moved towards the question of devolution, ultimately the devolution that would be granted during the early years of Tony Blair. Over the next couple of years, Powell sketched out his position. In his first speech on Northern Ireland in the House of Commons in April 1970, he argued for a greater amalgamation and uniformity of administration, government policy, and economy in the 6 counties and in the rest of the United Kingdom. The following year, his criticism of Stormont being the local government in Northern Ireland in Belfast, as he attributed it to some responsibility for sustaining the tensions by giving the impression that Northern Ireland's constitutional status was ambiguous, i.e., whether it was part of the United Kingdom or whether it was autonomous within the United Kingdom. Just before a short speaking tour of Northern Ireland, he stated in a widely reported interview with the Dublin Current Affairs magazine that Stormont itself is a threat to the British link because it is an assertion of separateness. Anything which blurs the status of Northern Ireland as part of the UK does practical harm in that it maintains or helps to maintain this basic fuel of disorder and disruption. Just weeks before Labour leader Harold Wilson spoke in the House of Commons in November of 1971 about his plan for a united Ireland with entry of the Republic of Ireland into the Commonwealth and the introduction of an oath of allegiance, Powell conjured up the spectre of national decline, contending that the future for a nation which failed or abandoned 1.5 million of its own citizens on its own soil would be dark indeed. The ignominy would be irreparable. I suppose, in terms of finding other examples which Powell would be aware of course, I talked about his admiration for Charles de Gaulle and his attempt essentially to peg France's pursuit of sovereignty and anti-Americanism to that of a long-term collaboration with Europe as a new political bloc against the Soviet Union and Britain. Within the context of de Gaulle's career, we see the war in Algeria, and perhaps the most controversial decision ever undertaken by de Gaulle was not to withdraw from Algeria, which up until that point had been legally part of France, part of the Fourth Republic. It was the abandonment of the Pied Noir, the French-born Algerian population, which I believe, if I recall, numbered in the population of 3 million. That was an instance in which France abandoned a formal part of the French Fourth Republic. It wasn't part of the metropole, but for all intents and purposes, legally, it was considered part of France in a way that other elements of the French overseas empire in Africa were not. And of course, it involved a repudiation of millions of French citizens. And as a result, there was a sustained attempt by elements of the French right to assassinate Charles de Gaulle for that decision. So it is not without recent precedent in Europe. Powell's argument for integration, based on the premise that Northern Ireland was part of the British nation, also involved the repudiation of any kind of Ulster separatism. In 1972 and 73, as the Vanguard movement, a pressure group within the Unionist Party, led by William Bill Craig, began calling for semi-independence, Powell promptly argued that this would have meant turning Unionism into the denial of itself, isolationism. Directly refuting the implications of the Vanguard publication, Ulster a Nation, Powell emphatically did not accept that there was such a thing as an Ulster nationality or Ulster nationalism, as he later explained. Powell did not dispute the existence of Ulster nationalism, but saw this as akin to other regional dimensions in Britain, profound, historic, and self-conscious. From Powell's perspective, integration stood to provide Unionists with an overarching theme. Yet as his involvement in Northern Irish politics increased, he was not only unable to persuade the Unionist Party to adopt it, but also often had to word his proposals in a way that did not offend entrenched pro-devolution attitudes, obscuring the clarity of his position. Powell had been close to Jim Molyneux, the MP for South Antrim, for several years. The two of them now spoke on the telephone on the 10th of February 1974, just 3 days after Powell revealed he would not stand as a Conservative. Powell's note of their conversation showed his high expectations. He authorized Molyneux to state that only if the loyal Ulster Unionists invited me to be their leader and to represent them at Westminster would I be prepared to consider any approach from Northern Ireland. His view was that having declined to stand as a Conservative candidate, I would need to be in personal control of the grounds and policy on which I might otherwise stand for Parliament in present circumstances. In the event, of course, Powell's hopes were thwarted amid a complex political situation in Northern Ireland. So we see Powell as essentially attempting to forge a new policy, a new way in British politics, having been ostracized by the Conservatives and his failure to ultimately reconcile with Thatcher over key issues, most prominently immigration. You can say that Powell's jump towards Ulster Unionism is a way of being able to establish not just relevance within the British political system, which some would characterize extremes, but it focuses on, he is able to focus his political career upon the defense of the British nation, which is to prevent Ulster separatism at a time where we're seeing the Troubles in Ireland, increased terrorism being perpetrated by organizations such as the Irish Republican Army, who desired to unify Ireland by terrorist recourse if necessary, and the ensuing political disunity which had been brought in the rest of Ireland. Ireland itself, which had always occupied a awkward political situation ever since the devolution of what would later become the Republic of Ireland in the south. And it is to this issue, this latent issue, which is going to plague British governments, I would argue still today, regardless of apologists for the Good Friday Agreement. It is this issue which Powell, you can say, is attempting to find relevance again. I would say that cynically, but sincerely, I believe that this is a frontier upon which Powell can effectively fight for the continued existence of the British nation state within its constituted territory. So I do not believe that this is simply a pursuit of political relevance, more so that this is a deep ideological commitment for him to appear to Ulster Unionism. And I think the sad thing here is that even within that much more limited purview of going towards the fringes of the United Kingdom and attempting to forge out a new political path outside the Conservative Party, Powell, rather than essentially being able to use this as a course to energize and become relevant, fades into increasing irrelevance. And I think nothing proves that more than what Tony Blair would ultimately do. Indeed, this was at a time where Powell himself would actually die. So, reiterating again this position about the last sort of bastion of, you can almost call it in many ways, people can denigrate it as one of the last bastions of the British Empire to those who are appealing to a united sense of Irish statehood encompassing the entire island. But of course, to Powell, such an argument would be completely antithetical. And this is consolidated in this idea of fealty to the United Kingdom and the essence of unionism. Loyalty to what? Union with what? There must be no doubt or division or prevarication about the answers to those questions. The answer is not loyalty to Ulster, nor loyalty to yourselves. The answer is not the union of these 6 counties, nor union among yourselves. The answer is loyalty to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There is no doubt that Powell was disappointed with the devolutionary direction of Thatcher's government policy towards Northern Ireland. While the Conservatives were in opposition, Powell had been close to Aeneid, the Conservative Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland, who appeared willing to move along integrationist lines. Indeed, Powell had readily endorsed the regional council scheme designed to strengthen local government proposed by the Conservatives under Neve's guidance in 1978. Neve was murdered by the Irish National Liberation Army, the military wing of the Irish Republican Socialist Party, on the 30th of March 1979, prompting Powell coldly to respond that Aeneid would have wished nothing better than to share the same end as so many of his innocent fellow citizens for whom the House of Commons is responsible. But as the Conservatives entered government, Powell still had reason to be hopeful in policy terms. The Conservative manifesto had stated that in the absence of devolved government, we will seek to establish one or more elected regional councils with a wide range of powers over local services. Moreover, Ian Gow, appointed as Thatcher's parliamentary private secretary, had in the past actively sought Powell's views on Northern Ireland. Now, on Powell's prompting, Gow sought to establish relations between Powell and Thatcher. He told Thatcher, "While I understand your concern at the wider implications of him seen arriving at Downing Street at the present time, I believe that Enoch is wholly trustworthy in his personal, if not political dealings." Thatcher and Powell duly met in late October of 1979. Yet the following month, with the regional council scheme abandoned, and with Humphrey Africans as Secretary of State of Northern Ireland seeking to establish a conference for the Northern Ireland political parties, Powell publicly argued that this represented a volte-face on the government's part, which now sought devolution. This was, of course, a continuation of the bipartisan British government approach, but Powell strikingly argued that Thatcher was pursuing it under pressure from Jack Lynch, the Republic of Ireland's Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, who was himself acting, as Powell saw it, under malign US influence. At this juncture, Powell was at the Northern Ireland office, looking hard for conspiracies and hints of deception. This was a new departure, but it related to Powell's long-held suspicion of US foreign policy and the corresponding threat to the British nation. Pessimism also ran alongside Powell's hopes. In August of 1984, with speculation mounting that a parliamentary tier will be created within the Anglo-Irish Council, established in 1981, to formalise relations between London and Dublin, he argued that if this happened, Parliament will be breaking the Union and in the process relinquishing its claims on Ulster allegiance, adopting the familiar Unionist narrative which West had deployed against him in 1975. Powell stated, "I say that the men of 1912 were right when they declared that the mother country would forfeit its right to their loyalty if it put them into a Dublin Parliament. The methods, which have been refined and elaborated since 1912, this is original Irish Home Rule, but the substance and end results intended are still the same. When the British government creates an Anglo-Irish body to comprise representatives and to deliberate on the affairs of this island, I will have renounced its claim upon the allegiance of the British people of this province." And to end, so this is Powell loses in 1987 and is out of the mainstream of politics from 1987 until his death in 1998. And this is ultimately his view as for the peace process in Ireland during the time of the John Major government and early Blair. As the peace process gathered momentum in the mid-1990s, Powell remained committed to integration as the only salvation for Northern Ireland. And indeed, there was briefly a resurgence of interest in the idea from prominent journalists in the Times, Telegraph, Sunday Telegraph, and the Spectator, sparked by concerns about the British commitment to Northern Ireland following the 1993 Downing Street Declaration, which argued for Irish self-determination, but stipulated that both parts of the island had to agree to any new settlement, and heightened the following years as the provisional IRA ceasefire made further negotiations possible. We can safely assume that Powell, who died before its conclusion, would have disapproved of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, under which a power-sharing assembly was set up and the people of Northern Ireland were able to hold British and/or Irish citizenship. Powell had frankly told Gow in 1982 that there was no serious prospect that the politicians committed to oppose or to promote a united Ireland will ever cooperate in joint administration of the province. Furthermore, just weeks before his death in 1998, Powell accepted an invitation to remain as vice president of Queen's University Ulster Unionist Association, a position he had held since 1970, with an emphatic statement of his own position. The struggle in Ireland is about the nation to which Ulster shall belong, and significantly, adding that there was no reason why it should depend upon a single religion. So, Powell began his career as a brigadier in military intelligence in India, attempting to find ways of prolonging the existence of the British Raj. This failed. He then entered the Conservative Party in the 1950s and became essentially attached to the Suez group, who advocated that essentially Britain should attempt to maintain hold of the remnant of the empire as a way of ensuring British sovereignty and collective obedience and subjecthood to the crown, in contrast to Soviet communism and American democracy. This failed, and he could do nothing but chide the incompetence of Anthony Eden, who had essentially created the conditions which allowed the Suez crisis to happen. In the 1960s, having essentially, we see a continual continual truncation of the remnants of Britain. We are now focusing on the ethnic cohesion and political system within Britain itself. Informed by his understanding and his experience within the broader empire, we now see the issues that plague the empire are being replicated as a microcosm within the metropole, to use the French analysis, but within the British nation itself, the United Kingdom. He loses this fight. His immigration debate, essentially, it appeals, as we see, to a vast majority of the sentiments of the British population. If we're talking, 74% versus 15% opposed. And yet, as he has also consistently remarked, it is a policy for which the British population were not consulted. And as with his opposition for supranational organizations such as the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and with the European Union, Powell is concerned about a loss of what he would consider British sovereignty vis-a-vis British democracy, to hand power from the majority to a ever-increasing and shadowy minority. At all events, he fears American contrivance and involvement to undermine the integrity first of the British Empire, and finally the integrity of the United Kingdom itself with regard to Northern Ireland. There are many reasons as to why I can speculate why that would be US policy, but the stream has already gone too long. But nevertheless, it represents a consistent theme also throughout Powell's thinking, which is realism regarding the position of the United States, that Britain, if it's to assert itself as a nation state, needs to end the master-lackey relationship that was essentially established with the quote-unquote fraternal association under Churchill, or would later be called by another euphemism, the special relationship. In terms of him being able to appeal to this new sort of realm of Britain seeking out its own foreign policy for a change. This is something I will argue consistently on this channel, which is that since 1907, Britain has pursued a policy of suicide. Suicide in terms of nearly all respects, not just in terms of the diminution of its international position, but also in terms of the diminution of the island of Britain itself, in terms of not only just sort of economic decline, cultural decline, civilizational decline, in all sense, we're talking about truncation and fracture. And the last sort of element in terms of foreign policy pushing out against this, of course, is the Gorbachev olive branch. The prospect that Gorbachev, leading a reformed, non-hostile Soviet Union, relinquishing its satrapies in Eastern Europe, could have formed a potential alternative power bloc for Europe versus the Soviet Union, which was, of course, an idea posited about as early as 1986, when we see the origins of perestroika and glasnost. Of course, these prospects regarding the frustration of a growing American unipolar world were quickly put to rest with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in late 1991. And of course, Powell can only witness the fact that the US unipolar world, the monopolization of supranational institutions such as the United Nations to justify interventions in Kuwait, to justify interventions in Yugoslavia, will only continue in terms of taking a realistic proposal of non-interference in foreign policy and instead tagging Britain alongside American involvement in these peripheral imperialistic gambits. And I will say that to confirm all of these points, we are seeing this as I say this, as I present this argument with the American missile strikes on the Houthis, which has been augmented by the UK government supporting and aiding in that policy. So nothing has changed. If anything, the situation has got worse regards to Powell's thinking on this issue. And then, of course, there is the final frontier in terms of defending the British nation state, which, of course, is in Northern Ireland, which was compromised by the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So, on all fronts, it is safe to say that Powell failed. He failed with the possible exception of economics, which I will put about 50 asterisks behind, to influence the direction of the Conservative Party, and by extension, the body politic and the direction of this country ever since. And that is, again, in terms of my overall consideration of the legacy of Enoch Powell, more justification to award him the epithet of the Last Briton. Because, like a Stilicho, or like a Cicero, or even going back to the old Latin quote, which I'm going to translate, the winning cause pleased the gods, but the losing cause pleased Cato. We're talking about a intellectual conception of Britain, on the one hand, as encapsulated in the ideas of Powellism, as representing some sort of vestige of genuine Toryism, which is the closest thing Britain has to a form of reactionary politics. And then we have the idea of British sovereignty, disabused from any ideology, just the hard fact of British sovereignty, something that Powell consistently fought for within the context of the empire and reduced to the context of Northern Ireland. And in all respects, again, in this theatre, he failed. As Aetius, as Majorian, as Stilicho, failed to preserve the Western Roman Empire from collapse. And again, amidst the overall conversation of immigration as being fundamental in terms of understanding that collapse. And as with the example of Stilicho again, we're talking about a man who is warning of these things well in advance, being pushed into the periphery of political life. Certainly in terms of how Powell would consider it, I think he would consider and did consider the 1968 removal of him from the shadow cabinet over racialism, as Ted Heath would describe it, as a betrayal, as a stab in the back. You can almost say that, again, going back to his Rivers and Blood speech and Roman equivalency, this is the court of Honorius getting into debauched activity in Ravenna, while Alaric is sacking the city of Rome, and Stilicho, a couple of years, have been executed for purported treason. Political sidelining and a fundamental sort of inability to be able to affect or even forestall the situation of decline. As I said, the idea that Britain could transition from an empire into a nation state, instead it transitioned from an empire into a client state. Now, I think, as a way of a summary, that is where I'm going to leave this conversation on Powell. It was very interesting to research. And like I said, I was surprised that there has been a renewal of objective, as far as I can see it, academic interest in Powell. Of course, I had to sift very carefully um, to find things which were interesting from my particular perspective, and I was able, I hope, with the various sources of which Corthorn in particular, which I'm indebted to, but especially with regards to foreign policy, um, I would say foreign policy is one of my strengths when it comes to understanding history, um, along with conceptual history, which is very much the focus of this conversation: conceptual history and foreign policy. And I find Powell fascinating because he's one of the very few figures who I would actually relate to in terms of being able to understand foreign policy, which is baffling within the context of. I'm not going to labour the point. It's just it's interesting to find someone who seems to be interested in focusing on a realist and self-centered, that's probably the wrong term to use, self-interested foreign policy, which isn't simply how am I going to describe it? Abject submission is a good way to describe it. All right, on to the super chats. Amazed if the stream doesn't get demonetized. Lady of Shalott for $5 Australian. Powell was my grandparents' MP for the Ulster Unionists in Southdown. Post his exit from the Conservatives, they met him during the constituency visit. Well, I saw your cigar stream a while ago on Northern Ireland. I was very interested to hear your views, but absolutely. So wonderful to have that personal connection. Lady of Shalott. War Freak Tindy for $5. Thank you very much. Can't watch the stream live, but just wanted to chime my appreciation and support for AM's work. Cheers. Looking forward to watching this one for sure. Well, I hope when you do watch it, Tindy, you do enjoy it. Thank you very much for the super chat in advance. What a tragic figure. Like Harold Goodwinson of the 20th century, a cultured and principled lion fighting for his homeland and outfoxed by Heath. Yeah, I don't really think he was outfoxed by Heath. I think Heath was just emblematic of the conservative establishment, not just as was, but writ large. The Conservatives have one trick, which they've played over and over and over again since 1688, and that one trick is betrayal. Um, Heath is nothing more than simply an agent of the decline of Britain, and the harbinger of the end of empire. This is consistent with Churchill, with Macmillan, with Eden, with Home, and going back before the war, I'd say it was actually consistent with Stanley Baldwin. The only thing that really separates Stanley Baldwin from the other figures is that I do believe that Stanley Baldwin was a master political actor, but in the same way he represented all of the vices and deficiencies which characterize nearly all sort of modern conservative politicians since the Lord Salisbury, Robert Cecil, who ceased to become prime minister in 1902, who I will contend was the last decent prime minister we had. Right. But thank you for that, Bolero 393. Bob Fred 159. Over Europe, who was correct, Powell or Mosley? I don't know enough about Oswald Mosley to be able to justify that comment, I'm afraid. But thank you for the super chat. Here's some cash, Wiggles £10. Might Powell support European strategic autonomy and EU membership nowadays? Fantastic stuff. I don't really know how Powell can cope with the extent of the diminution of British sovereignty. I mean, Europe, as has been decisively proven over the last 2 years, is not a sovereign entity. It is not an alternative power bloc at all. It is simply a collection of satrapies. Effectively, it is not a bloc in and of itself. It represents a international superstructure which is fundamentally operated under the guidance of a single power, which is not European. Um, just from my point of view, I voted to remain in the European Union during the Brexit referendum, and what I find depressing about that is I alone probably was the only person to vote for the reasons I did, but I voted for similar reasons that Powell would have, which is that I believe that us being a part of the European Union was some break on on Atlanticism. It was some way of preventing the complete and utter dominance of the United States over British politics. And I don't really want to say that I told you so, but I think given how events have transpired over the last 8 years, I unfortunately think that my belief has been fully vindicated. So maybe Powell would, within that context, support EU membership. But like I said, the EU has all the problems which Powell faced in the 1970s, but much worse. So it would be a desperate gambit, to say the least. Bolero 393 for $5. Future PMs won't be able to speak English, let alone ancient Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Urdu, etc. Future leftists will claim he was actually black. Well, future leftists won't claim he was actually black. They will declare that he was one of the last dying embers of British. I have to read this quote again from the article I read before. He will claim that. Oh, how have I lost it? And anyway, yes, here we are. With red-blooded imperialism running untempered in his veins, I think that will be his legacy. um, But Bolero 393 does bring up another interesting point regarding Powell, is that Powell was a polymath. In addition to being a classicist and a full professor at the age of 25, Powell, I have varying sources on this, but some sources contend that Powell spoke at least 12 languages. Urdu, of course, being the uh, literary and elite language of Indian Muslims and the lingua franca of Pakistan. So this is why I think the accusations of racialism perturbed him so much, because yes, he was an English nationalist, yes, he was a particularist, but he wasn't a chauvinist. By any stretch of the imagination. He had a fascination and a deep investment in the cultures of the empire. And indeed, I would say it was his anti-chauvinism and his perennialism which facilitated his realist view regarding foreign policy, such as his perhaps correct estimate that the Soviet Union, rather than simply representing the advance of international communism, was actually acting consistent with the foreign policy of Tsar Alexander in 1812 and Tsar Nicholas II in 1914. Right, that is the end of the super chats. Thank you very much. Um, there's really little more I can say on this topic, so I will just say thank you to everyone for watching this lecture. Hopefully it'll stay up and not be demonetized, one can hope. And hopefully I will see you in a couple of weeks to again segue from this conversation quite nicely onto something that I wanted to talk about for a very long time, which is the career and political philosophy of one Charles de Gaulle. Thank you very much.